Have you ever wondered when humans first realized that the deadliest thing in the world was not the storm, not the beast, not the cold, but each other long before cities, kings, or war? There was a quiet and terrifying moment when one human looked at another and understood that death could be chosen. That single realization may have changed our species forever. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more mystery and history. Because this story begins in silence and ends in the shadow of everything humanity would become. The moment itself leaves no inscription, no carved record, no voice preserved in stone or clay, but it lingers in the oldest traces of human life like a shadow that refuses to disappear. Somewhere in a landscape without names, beneath a sky that has not yet been mapped or mythologized, a human being looks at another human being and realizes something that cannot be undone. Not that death exists. That has always been known. Bodies fail, animals tear, fools shatter, hunger empties. Death is everywhere. But this is different. This is the recognition that death can be chosen, directed, delivered not by storm or beast, but by a hand that looks like your own. Before that realization, the world is already dangerous, but it is not yet morally complicated in the same way. Early humans live inside a constant negotiation with risk. The ground is uneven, the dark is full of movement, and every sound beyond the edge of the fire might signal teeth or claws. Survival depends on attention, memory, and cooperation. Bodies are fragile, but they are also shared. Injury to one threatens the group. Care is not optional, it is a condition of continuity. Even in the earliest fossil records, there are signs of individuals who survive long after crippling injuries, suggesting that others carried them, fed them, protected them. What survives in the record suggests that compassion is not a late invention, but a deeply rooted behavior. Yet this same closeness creates another kind of tension. These are small groups, often no more than a few dozen individuals, bound together by kinship, familiarity, and necessity. There is no anonymity. Every face is known. Every action is visible. Resources are limited. Movement is constant. And the margin for error is thin. A bad decision, a misjudged hunt, a moment of carelessness, these can ripple outward with consequences that affect everyone. In such a world, cooperation is essential. But it is not always smooth. Friction exists. It must. The early human environment is not peaceful in any romantic sense. It is alive with pressure. Competition with other predators is constant. Large cats, hyenas, and other scavengers do not simply avoid human groups. They test them, circle them, challenge them. The human body, upright and exposed, is not naturally armoured. It survives not because it is stronger, but because it is more aware, more coordinated, more capable of shared intention. The first tools simple stones shaped to cut, scrape, and break extend the body's reach, but they are not yet symbols of dominance. They are instruments of necessity. Still, something begins to change as these tools become more refined. A sharp edge is not only useful against bone and hide, it has a potential that is not immediately realized, but it is there. A heavy stone, used to crack marrow-rich bones, is also capable of breaking something else. The human skull is not built to withstand deliberate force. It protects the brain, but it is not invulnerable. The difference between accident and intention is subtle at first, almost indistinguishable in the archaeological record. A fall, a strike, a miscalculation. These leave marks that can be difficult to interpret tens of thousands of years later. Scholars still debate where exactly that line is first crossed, but the conditions for that crossing are already present. There are moments of scarcity, when food is not enough, moments of stress, when movement is forced by drought, cold, or the presence of other groups, moments of internal tension, when individuals compete for status, for access to mates, for influence within the group. These are not abstract pressures. They are immediate, physical, and often unresolved. Imagine a camp at dusk. The light is low, the fire is small, and the group is quiet after a long day. There is no language as we understand it now, but there is communication gestures, sounds, shared signals that carry meaning. There is memory. There is recognition. There is also frustration. A hunt has failed. Someone has taken more than their share. Someone has been excluded, or challenged, or ignored. These are small things, but in a world with no formal systems to absorb conflict, they accumulate. The human mind at this stage is already complex. It can plan, anticipate, remember past interactions, and predict future behavior. It can feel fear, attachment, resentment. It can recognize patterns. It can also imagine outcomes. This capacity to simulate what might happen is one of the most powerful tools early humans possess. It allows them to track animals, to navigate landscapes, to survive in changing conditions. But it also opens the door to something else, the ability to imagine harm. There is no clear moment where imagination becomes action, but it is not difficult to see how one could lead to the other. A gesture becomes more forceful, a shove becomes a strike becomes something that does not stop when the other falls. The body, once a shared vulnerability, becomes a target. At first, such an act would not be understood in the way later societies understand killing. There are no words for murder, no laws, no moral codes written or spoken in structured form. There is only the immediate reality of what has happened. A person lies still who was once moving. A presence is gone. The group must respond. But how? The evidence for these earliest moments is fragmentary, scattered across sites that are separated by vast stretches of time and space. A skull with a fracture that does not match an accidental fall. Bones with marks that suggest force applied in a specific direction. In some cases, injuries that show signs of healing indicating that violence did not always result in death, but was nevertheless part of human interaction. These are not definitive proof of intention, but they are suggestive. They form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. One of the most striking aspects of this early period is how little we can say with certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every trace we find. Some researchers argue that interpersonal violence is rare in these early groups, that cooperation dominates, and conflict is usually resolved without lethal force. Others point to the growing number of sites that show signs of trauma and argue that violence may be more common than once believed. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, shaped by environment, population density, and the specific dynamics of each group. What is clear is that the human body has always been both resilient and vulnerable. It can endure injury, adapt to hardship, recover from wounds that would seem unsurvivable, but it is also easily broken under the right conditions. The realization of this duality, that strength and fragility coexist in the same form, may be one of the earliest steps toward understanding that harm can be intentional. Before this realization fully takes hold, there is still a kind of innocence, though not in the sense of purity or peace. It is an innocence of limitation. Humans know what they experience, what they see, what they survive. They know that death comes, but not necessarily that it can be chosen in a calculated way by one of their own. Once that boundary is crossed, even once, it changes the landscape of human interaction. The firelight no longer illuminates only safety, it also casts longer shadows. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because what follows is not a simple story of violence emerging from nowhere. It is a slow unfolding, shaped by biology, environment, and the fragile complexity of early human relationships. The moment humans realize they can kill each other is not a single event, but a threshold crossed gradually, unevenly, and perhaps more than once in different places and times. And once crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. The world remains the same in many ways. The same landscapes, the same predators, the same cycles of scarcity and abundance. But something has shifted beneath the surface. A new possibility exists, one that does not depend on claws or fangs or falling rocks. It depends on intention, on decision, on the capacity to act in a way that ends another human life. That knowledge does not spread instantly. It does not become a shared doctrine. It exists first as an experience, a memory carried by those who witness it, those who survive it, and perhaps those who commit it. It may be resisted, denied, or misunderstood, but it is there, and it begins to shape behavior in subtle ways. A glance lasts a little longer, a gesture is interpreted differently. Trust, once assumed within the group, becomes something that can be tested, strained, and, eventually, broken. The first realization is quiet. It leaves no monument, but it echoes forward through every stage of human history that follows. Long before one human becomes a danger to another in any deliberate and lasting sense, the body has already spent millions of years learning fear. Fear is older than language, older than memory in any personal form, older even than the branch of humanity that will eventually call itself human. It lives in the nervous system, in the sudden tightening of muscle, in the involuntary turn toward movement in grass or shadow at the edge of vision. The first teachers of fear are not rivals from the same species. They are the world itself. Teeth in the dark, a drop from height, a hoof striking unexpectedly, infection in a cut too small to notice, cold that settles into the chest and does not leave. The earliest humans and their close relatives grow up in a universe where pain is not rare, and injury is not abstract. It is immediate, visible, and often shared. This matters because the road toward human-on-human killing does not begin with hatred. It begins with knowledge of damage. A body must first learn what it means to be broken before it can understand that breaking can be caused, predicted, or repeated. In that sense, the earliest archive of violence is not interpersonal at all. It is anatomical. Healed fractures, crushed limbs, missing teeth, damaged joints, and skulls marked by old trauma all show that prehistoric life is physically punishing. Some individuals live for years with deformities that would have made movement difficult and pain constant. Their survival strongly suggests that others help them endure. Care and suffering grow side by side. Among early hominins and later early humans, the body is constantly being tested. Hunting or scavenging large animals means approaching creatures that are wounded, cornered, or still dangerous even in death. Breaking bones for marrow means lifting heavy stones and striking with force. Moving through rocky terrain means slips, falls, and impact. Fire offers warmth and protection, but it also burns. Even without deliberate violence, the human skeleton accumulates the marks of a hard existence. The evidence does not show a gentle world interrupted by conflict. It shows a harsh world in which conflict becomes thinkable, because bodies are already understood as vulnerable objects within it. The role of predators in this story is difficult to overstate. For much of prehistory, humans are not the unquestioned masters of the landscape. They are one intelligent primate among many competing creatures, and often not the most physically imposing. Big cats can ambush from cover. Hyenas can strip a carcass and crush bone. Packs of wild dogs can harass and exhaust. Large snakes, crocodiles, and raptors threaten the young. Even after the controlled use of fire and more sophisticated tools, human groups remain cautious around waterholes, wooded edges, cave mouths, and migration routes. Many of the places that promise food also promise danger. That long exposure to predators shapes more than reflects. It shapes perception. Early humans become skilled readers of intention. They watch posture, movement, spacing, speed. They learn to distinguish curiosity from attack, hesitation from commitment. A crouched body means one thing, a direct charge means another. Stillness can be as important as motion. This constant reading of threat almost certainly extends beyond animals. Once the brain is trained to interpret stance, tension, and momentum, it does not stop when the figure being observed is human. The same attention that keeps a hunter alive near a wounded antelope or a stalking cat may later help him recognize aggression in another member of his own group. There is a surprising detail here, one often lost beneath later ideas of war and organized violence. The earliest human understanding of danger may be deeply physical rather than moral. A dangerous individual is not yet evil, criminal, or dishonorable. He is simply someone whose body and behavior have become unpredictable in a way that threatens others. That distinction is important. It suggests that the first fear of other humans may arise not from abstract concepts of malice, but from a practical recognition this person can do damage. The archaeological record offers hints of such recognition, though never in a complete or comfortable form. There are skulls with depressed fractures that heal, meaning the injured person lives on after a heavy blow. There are broken forearms that resemble defensive injuries, the kind that can occur when someone raises an arm to shield the head. Scholars remain cautious because accidents can create similar patterns, and the evidence remains incomplete. Still, as more sites accumulate, a difficult picture emerges. Injury in prehistoric life is not only environmental, some of it appears directional, concentrated, and personal. The social structure of small foraging bands makes these injuries especially significant. In a later village or city, conflict can be diffused across many relationships. In a small band, every conflict is intimate, every grievance has a face attached to it. There is no prison, no court, no distant authority, no formal police. There is only reputation, memory, and the immediate reaction of others. That means violence, when it happens, is rarely anonymous. It carries emotional residue. The injured person remains present. The person who caused the injury remains present too. The group must go on eating, moving, sleeping, and surviving with the memory of what occurred still close at hand. This is where fear begins to change shape. A predator attacks from outside the circle. Injury from within is different. It corrodes confidence in the very system that keeps a small group alive. A human group survives because its members share watchfulness, share food when necessary, share labor, and care for children across more than one pair of parents. Once a member of that group becomes a serious source of injury, the danger is no longer confined to the edges of camp. It has moved inward. The fire still burns, but it no longer defines a complete boundary between safety and threat. What survives in the record suggests that early humans may have responded to such tension in many ways that leave little trace. Avoidance is one possibility. So is temporary separation. So is expulsion. In very small groups, the removal of one disruptive individual may be more adaptive than repeated conflict. Yet exclusion in a dangerous environment can itself be close to a death sentence, especially for the injured, the old, or the socially isolated. Scholars still debate how often expulsion occurred and under what conditions, but it may have been one of the earliest tools for conflict management long before formal punishment existed. Jealousy also enters the picture, though cautiously, because direct evidence is almost impossible to recover. Human reproduction is slow, parental investment is high, and access to mates has likely mattered deeply for much of our evolutionary history. Rivalry is therefore not a modern invention. In bands where everyone knows one another's place and contributions, shifts in alliance or affection can carry extraordinary weight. A slight that would later become gossip or private resentment may in a small prehistoric group become a lasting fracture. That does not mean every group is ruled by sexual competition or dominance struggles. Far from it. Cooperation remains the dominant condition of survival. But no stable social world is free of friction, and in environments with constant stress, friction can sharpen quickly. Children, too, grow up watching how bodies affect one another. They see adults restrain, shove, strike in anger, or return injured from conflicts whose causes they cannot fully understand. Even if lethal violence remains rare, the possibility of bodily harm is part of social learning. A child does not need a theory of murder to understand that force changes behavior. A blow makes someone fall. A thrown stone draws blood. A stronger body can dominate a weaker one. These lessons accumulate long before they are named. Another lesser-known detail from paleoanthropology complicates the picture further. Some hominin species and early human populations appear to have lived alongside one another, or at least overlapped in time and territory. Encounters between different human groups, whether between closely related populations or more distant ones, may have generated forms of tension different from those within a band. A stranger who looks almost like you but not entirely, who uses the same water source or follows the same prey, may be classified differently in the mind. The evidence does not allow certainty about how often such encounters turned violent, but it raises an important possibility. Humans may have learned both trust and suspicion through contact with those who are recognizably human yet not familiar. This is part of why the story cannot be reduced to instinct alone. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of interpersonal violence. Biology provides the capacity for aggression, but capacity is not destiny. Environment creates pressure, but pressure does not guarantee killing. Social bonds promote restraint. Yet those same bonds can intensify resentment when they fray. The earliest human experience of harm is therefore layered. First comes the knowledge that bodies can be damaged by the world. Then comes the discovery that bodies can be damaged by those who share the same campfire. Once that second realization begins to form, even imperfectly, memory changes. A scar is no longer only a reminder of a fall, an animal, or a careless strike during labor. It may become a reminder of intention. A person approaching too quickly is judged not just by proximity, but by history. The hand holding a stone is not merely a working hand. Under certain conditions, it is something else. This does not make early humanity uniquely brutal. In many ways, the deeper lesson is the opposite. The remarkable thing is not that violence appears, it is that life in such intimate and precarious groups can continue at all. The same species capable of inflicting harm is also capable of prolonged care. patience, food sharing, and mutual defense. Bones with severe healed trauma remind us not only that injury occurs, but that the injured are often kept alive. That contradiction runs through the whole human story. Compassion and violence are not separate eras, they are intertwined capacities, and so the path toward the first unmistakably human killing is not a sudden fall from innocence into savagery. It is a tightening field of experience. Bodies learn pain from the world. Minds learn to read threat. Groups learn that danger can come from within as well as without. Scars accumulate. Memories do too. By the time one human raises a hand against another with decisive intent, the intellectual tools required for that act have already been assembling for generations. The body has already taught the lesson. It only remains for someone to use it. At some point, in some place now lost to weather, scavengers, and time, a blow lands that is not part of work, not part of accident, not part of the ordinary punishment imposed by the landscape. It lands with purpose, whether sudden or simmering, whether born from panic or rage or calculation too primitive to leave a name behind. The force is enough to change the situation completely. A person falls, perhaps stunned first, perhaps dead almost at once. Others see it happen, or arrive moments later and understand from the shape of the body, from the blood, from the stillness, that something has occurred which belongs to neither hunt nor misstep. This is the threshold the record can only approach in fragments, the first human blow that is recognizably meant for another human being. The archaeological evidence for such moments is frustrating precisely because it is so close to speaking and yet remains silent. A fractured skull does not tell us what emotion moved the arm. A broken rib does not reveal whether there had been warning, argument, or fear beforehand. Bones preserve outcome, not intention. Even so, certain injuries begin to stand out from the general background of prehistoric hardship. They appear in places where the angle, depth, and location of trauma suggest a directed strike rather than a random fall. A depressed fracture high on the cranial vault, repeated blows to the same area, damage that seems concentrated in ways hard to explain by accident alone. Scholars remain careful, because caution is the only honest posture when the evidence remains incomplete. But caution does not erase pattern. Some of the earliest disputed examples come from very ancient hominin remains, where skull fractures have been examined and re-examined for signs of deliberate impact. The debates are intense because so much depends on interpretation. If a broken skull can be explained by a fall on stone, then the case for interpersonal violence weakens. If the fracture pattern resembles force delivered by a handheld object, the story shifts. The further back in time the evidence goes, the less secure any conclusion becomes, and yet the possibility refuses to vanish. Human ancestors did not suddenly become capable of harming one another only when agriculture, cities, or metal weapons appeared. The body did not change that dramatically. The hand, the arm, the stone, the sharpened edge all existed long before states did. A particularly telling sign in this story is not always death itself, but survival after assault. Some prehistoric skulls show healed fractures consistent with violent impact. That means the blow was not fatal, but the event was nevertheless serious enough to leave a lasting record in bone. Such injuries matter because they suggest repetition. A single ambiguous wound might be accidental. A pattern of cranial trauma across multiple individuals in a population begins to imply something more regular. What survives in the record suggests that by the time fully modern humans spread across wider landscapes, Force between individuals may already be part of life in at least some communities. Yet the first lethal blow is unlikely to emerge from nowhere. It probably grows out of the same kinds of actions that precede it: shoving, striking, restraining, throwing objects, punishing, defending. There is no bright line between rough conflict and killing. A person may intend to hurt, not to kill, and discover that the difference is smaller than expected. The human skull is resilient enough to protect the brain from ordinary bumps, but under the concentrated force of a stone or club it becomes terrifyingly fragile. One misjudged strike can collapse the boundary between conflict and irreversible loss. In that sense, one of the earliest realizations may not be that a human can kill another human on purpose, but that he can do so at all. That discovery carries its own shock. To hunt an animal is already to understand the mechanics of fatal injury. Early humans know where to cut, where to strike, how blood loss weakens, how force disables movement. They know the body from butchery, from childbirth, from illness, from caring for the wounded. But there is a difference between knowledge applied to prey and knowledge applied to one's own kind. The resemblance is too close. The same structure under skin, the same sounds of distress, the same collapse of limbs once the body can no longer coordinate itself. No single explanation fully accounts for how that mental barrier is crossed, but once crossed, it reveals something deeply unsettling. The human body is both familiar and destructible by familiar means. This is where intention becomes difficult and important. It is possible that some of the earliest killings happen in the middle of confusion during fights, during frantic struggles over resources, during moments when fear overtakes restraint. A strike meant to stop becomes a strike that kills. But over time, the mere existence of such outcomes changes future behavior. The group learns. The person who has seen another die from a blow knows something those without that memory do not. A stone is no longer only a tool. A heavy branch is no longer only fuel or leverage. The hand becomes conceptually different once it has proved capable of ending a life within the group. The social aftermath may be even more important than the act itself. In a small band, death removes more than one individual. It alters labour, childcare, food gathering, defence, and emotional equilibrium all at once. A skilled forager gone means fewer calories. A parent gone means a child's survival becomes less certain. A strong adult gone means the group's margin against predators narrows. The first human killing is therefore not simply a moral event or a psychological one. It is an ecological event inside the group. The loss reverberates. How do the others respond? The record cannot say, but anthropology offers grounded possibilities. They may separate the aggressor from the group, temporarily or permanently. They may retaliate. They may interpret the killing as a dangerous breach requiring immediate collective restraint. Or, in some cases, they may tolerate it if the victim was already marginal, threatening, or entangled in a larger dispute. This last possibility is uncomfortable but important. Not all early communities are likely to judge violence in the same way. Even today, violence is filtered through social status, kinship, reputation, and context. There is no reason to imagine prehistory as simpler in this regard. A lesser-known but revealing clue comes from patterns of trauma that differ by sex, age, and social context in some later prehistoric remains. In certain populations, adult males seem more likely to carry healed cranial injuries, suggesting repeated risk from direct conflict. In others, evidence is more mixed. This does not prove universal male violence or exclude women from conflict. It simply hints that interpersonal aggression may sometimes cluster around status competition, hunting prestige, or social tension between adult men. Scholars still debate these patterns, and the sample sizes are often small, but they remind us that the first lethal blows probably do not occur in an undifferentiated social field. They occur in real communities with roles, expectations, alliances, and resentments. There is also the question of self-defense. One of the earliest human killings may not be an act of domination but of protection. A person under threat learns that stopping an attacker decisively may be the only way to survive. That possibility complicates every effort to narrate origins. Violence does not have a single source. The same blow can be read as murder by one witness, necessary defense by another, tragic accident by a third. Bones do not preserve motive, and scholars are right to resist overconfidence. But from the point of view of human cognition, the effect may be similar regardless of justification. Once a human has killed another human, the knowledge exists in the group. That knowledge does not need to become common to be transformative. Even a rare event can reshape collective behavior. People remember the conditions that preceded it. They watch certain individuals differently. They intervene earlier in quarrels. They become alert to the escalation of body language, to the presence of stones within reach, to the dangerous narrowing of another person's attention. In this way, the first lethal blow may help create the first intuitive rules against lethal escalation, long before formal law appears, not because anyone has articulated a philosophy, but because memory has become instructive. This is one reason the transition from injury to killing may be so profound. Injury can be absorbed, a broken arm can heal, a scar can be carried, a missing tooth can be adapted to. Death is final in a way that early humans understand perfectly well. They may not frame it in modern metaphysical terms, but they know the difference between the wounded and the gone. Once one person has caused that final state in another, a new category of action enters human life. It does not need a word to be real. There is a cinematic temptation to imagine this first killing as dramatic a confrontation on a cliff edge, a chase through reeds, a raised stone under a storm-dark sky. The truth is likely less theatrical and more disturbing. It may happen during a dispute over food, during an argument over a place by the fire, during a struggle over a child, during a burst of fear at night when movement is misread as threat. It may happen between people who have slept beside one another for years. That intimacy makes it more, not less, significant. Predators kill from outside. This kind of death comes from within the circle of recognition. And once such a death has happened, the imagination of future violence becomes easier, not inevitable, but easier. The impossible has become possible. The body has demonstrated what the mind only dimly suspected. Under enough pressure, a human being can decide to treat another human body the way he treats prey, obstacle, or threat. That does not erase care, affection, or dependence. Those remain, but they now coexist with a darker comprehension. So the first human blow is not only a strike to bone, it is a strike to trust. It reveals that the group's greatest strength, its closeness, its mutual knowledge, its coordinated capacity, also contains a hidden vulnerability. Humans know where other humans are weak because they know their own weakness from the inside. The arm lifts, the stone falls, someone does not get up. And in that silence afterward, a new kind of memory enters the human world. Once a human being understands that another human body can be broken by force, the objects scattered across daily life begin to look different. A stone flake resting beside butchered bone is still a tool, but not only a tool, A digging stick hardened in fire, a hammerstone used to split marrow, a sharpened wooden point carried for hunting or probing the ground, each remains tied to work, survival, and food. Yet each also contains another possibility, quiet at first, almost hidden by habit. The same intelligence that sees an edge where others see a rock can also see a weapon where there was once only an implement. This is one of the most important turns in the story, because it does not require the invention of anything entirely new. It requires only recognition. For most of prehistory, there is no clean division between tool and weapon. The categories themselves are modern. A hand axe can butcher an animal, strip bark, cut plant fibers, and crush a skull. A wooden spear can bring down medium-sized game, threaten predators, or keep another person at a distance. Even simple throwing stones, among the oldest and most universal human technologies, are impossible to classify in a stable way. They are practical, abundant, and deadly enough under the right conditions. Scholars still debate when specifically designed weapons for human conflict become common, but the earlier phase is more ambiguous and perhaps more revealing. Before weapons have a separate identity, violence borrows from ordinary life. That ambiguity is visible in the archaeological record. Stone points and blades survive in great numbers, but their exact use often does not. A point embedded in an animal bone suggests hunting. A point embedded in a human skeleton suggests something else, though even then the full context may remain uncertain. Was it interpersonal violence, a raid, an accident during hunting, a ritual killing, a post-mortem act? The evidence remains incomplete. Still, the broad pattern matters over time. Some tools become lighter, more standardized, more suited for piercing at distance. Projectiles become more effective, hafting improves, adhesives and bindings become stronger. Technological sophistication increases not just the efficiency of subsistence, but the efficiency of harm. This does not mean invention is driven mainly by conflict. Most tools are still made to solve the immediate problems of survival. Human groups need to cut, carry, pierce, grind, scrape, and defend themselves against animals long before they organize against one another. But once a technology exists, it does not remain innocent. A spear built for antelope does not fail to work on a person. In some cases, it may work better. The human body is smaller, thinner boned, and less protected by muscle or hide than many of the animals early humans hunt. That is part of the grim logic of the transformation. Hunting teaches distance, timing, cooperation, and anatomical vulnerability. Those lessons do not stay confined to prey. This is where the development of throwing technology may matter especially. To strike another body at close range is one kind of act. To injure from a distance is another. Distance changes psychology. It reduces immediate risk. It can also reduce hesitation. A thrown stone, a cast spear, and much later the bow all widen the space in which humans can act violently without direct bodily entanglement. The earliest stages of this process are difficult to reconstruct, but the implications are profound. Once the arm can project force beyond its immediate reach, conflict changes character. The victim no longer needs to be grappled, overpowered, or pinned. He only needs to be within range. What survives in the record suggests that early humans become extraordinarily skilled throwers compared with other primates. The human shoulder, torso, and wrist evolve in ways that make accurate, forceful throwing possible on a remarkable scale. This ability is usually discussed in the context of hunting, and rightly so. But it has another consequence. A species that can wound from a distance with stones and spears is a species that has acquired a powerful option in social conflict. No single explanation fully accounts for how often this option is used against other humans in the distant past. But once the capacity exists, it changes the field of possibility permanently. There is also a subtler transformation. Tools do not only extend strength, they reshape thought. A sharpened point invites planning. It asks the maker to imagine use before use occurs. That future-oriented imagination is one of humanity's great advantages. It allows the making of traps, clothing, shelters, containers, and carefully prepared hunting equipment. But it also permits a dangerous anticipation. A person can now imagine not only striking in anger, but preparing for a future confrontation, carrying a particular implement, placing it within reach, selecting a heavier stone instead of a lighter one. These are small acts, but they belong to a new mental landscape. Violence no longer has to be purely impulsive. It can be anticipated. The distinction between opportunistic violence and prepared violence may be one of the deepest thresholds in human history. An unplanned blow in the middle of a quarrel reveals that humans can kill. A prepared object, chosen because it will kill more effectively, reveals that humans can intend killing before the moment arrives. Scholars still debate how early such foresight enters the record in a meaningful way. But once hunting systems become more elaborate, the line grows thinner. Anyone capable of preparing for an ambush against prey is capable, in principle, of preparing for an ambush against a rival. The emotional consequences of this change are easy to overlook. In a world where tools are shared, made in view of others, and used in daily tasks, the presence of danger becomes harder to isolate. There is no separate armory, no locked rack of weapons. The dangerous object may lie beside the hearth. It may be the same object used an hour earlier to cut meat, shape wood, or process hides. This makes trust more fragile in an intimate way. It is not only that a person might become violent, it is that the material means are always close at hand. A surprising detail from ethnographic comparison helps illuminate this older world. In many small-scale societies documented much later, the same objects often shift fluidly between subsistence, ritual, prestige, and conflict. A spear may be a hunting tool, a symbol of adulthood, a marker of identity, and an instrument of feud. While direct comparison across vast time spans must be done cautiously, the principle is useful. Objects acquire meaning from relationships, not just design. An implement becomes a weapon when social conditions make it one. That social condition may begin with fear. Once a group has seen what a pointed shaft or a heavy stone can do to a human body, ordinary objects cease to be ordinary in moments of tension. A hand reaching too quickly for a tool can trigger alarm. A person known for volatility changes the atmosphere merely by carrying what everyone else carries. The material world has not changed, but the interpretation of it has. This is one of the quiet revolutions in early violence. Not the sudden invention of weapons, but the reinterpretation of everyday technology under the pressure of memory. At the same time, conflict between groups may begin to reward certain forms of tool-making. If two bands compete repeatedly for water, foraging territory, or access to migration routes, then the individuals best able to threaten, wound, or deter rivals gain a practical advantage. That does not necessarily mean full-scale battle, and it does not mean prehistory becomes a constant war of all against all. The older romantic image of peaceful harmony and the darker fantasy of endless primal slaughter both flatten the evidence. The truth is likely variable. Some landscapes and periods may be relatively calm. Others may be tense and deadly. But where conflict recurs, tools that can also serve as weapons become more important. One of the strongest examples of this later in prehistory is the widespread appearance of projectile technology, refined enough to kill efficiently. Stone-tipped spears, and eventually arrows, leave a different kind of mark on both bodies and social behavior. Embedded points in human remains show not just violence but the mechanics of it. The wound path reveals angle and force. The placement suggests pursuit, surprise, or frontal conflict. Yet even before such clear evidence becomes more common, the conceptual shift is already underway. A sharpened implement is no longer judged only by how well it cuts hide or penetrates animal flesh. It is also judged, consciously or not, by what it could do in another context. This does something to status as well. Skill with tools is never purely technical. It brings prestige. The best napper, the most accurate thrower, the most reliable hunter acquires social weight. In most cases, that weight helps the group. Competence feeds others and increases survival. But the same prestige may also create tension. Admiration can turn into rivalry. Unequal access to tools, skill, or resources can sharpen resentments already present beneath the surface. The individual most capable of protecting the group may also be the one most capable of threatening it from within. And so the moment tools become weapons is not a single invention or date. It is a long moral and cognitive reclassification. The stone point does not announce its dual use. The club does not distinguish between bone and branch in advance. Humans make that distinction, and then erase it when circumstances change. What was created to secure life becomes capable of ending it. What was held in trust becomes held in suspicion. This is one of the reasons the archaeological record of early violence is so difficult to read. It is built from objects that are never only one thing. A spear found near a human skeleton may be a weapon, a grave good, a hunting tool, or all three at once. A fractured skull near heavy stones may record murder, punishment, panic, or self-defense. Scholars are right to resist certainty, but uncertainty does not mean absence. It means that human violence emerges inside ordinary life, not outside it. The camp remains the same on the surface. Stone flakes glitter in the dust, wooden shafts lean against shelter frames, hands work sinew, hide, bark, and bone. Children watch and learn. Firelight catches sharp edges. Nothing in the scene looks like a battlefield, and yet the ingredients of one are already present. A tool is lifted, tested for balance, and set down again. Someone notices, someone remembers, and the ordinary world grows sharper. By the time violence becomes imaginable within a human group, it does not need open chaos to thrive. It can grow in the narrow spaces of ordinary life, in glances that linger too long, in uneven distributions of food, in grievances that cannot be spoken clearly, and therefore cannot be settled cleanly. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to reconstruct, because archaeology is better at preserving bones than moods. A campsite rarely fossilizes suspicion. Yet if humans reach the point of killing one another, then long before that act there must be a social atmosphere in which fear, resentment, exclusion, and rivalry have already become familiar enough to shape behavior. The campfire, for all its warmth, is not only a place of shelter, it is also a place where everyone sees everyone else. Small prehistoric groups live under conditions of extraordinary intimacy. In later societies, one can disappear into crowds, leave a settlement, change allegiance, or at least put distance between oneself and a rival. In a small foraging band, there is almost nowhere to hide. People sleep near one another, eat together, move together, and depend upon one another in ways that are immediate and often unforgiving. A poor hunter may still be tolerated if he contributes in other ways. A difficult personality may be endured if she is closely tied to crucial kin. A selfish act may be remembered long after the food crisis that provoked it has passed. Nothing vanishes quickly in a small group. Memory has too much space to work with. This intimacy can produce stability. It can also produce suffocating tension. The same familiarity that allows cooperation also sharpens sensitivity to disrespect. Humans are intensely social readers. Long before written law or formal hierarchy, they notice who receives attention, who eats first, who sits closest to the fire, who is deferred to, who is interrupted, who is ignored. These observations do not need language in the modern sense to carry force. They become part of social intuition. A person who is repeatedly pushed outward, spoken over, physically corrected, or denied access to desired resources does not need a political theory to feel grievance. That feeling may remain manageable for long stretches, but under pressure it can harden. Scarcity is one pressure, not a constant universal famine, but repeated moments when the margin narrows. A hunting return is poor, a season is colder than expected, a local patch of resources has been overused. Children cry more often from hunger. The old move more slowly. The group must decide, implicitly or explicitly, who gets what, who rests, who works, who risks the dangerous route, who is worth carrying when the pace must quicken. What survives in the record suggests that early humans are often cooperative under stress, yet stress does not create only solidarity. It also reveals fault lines. When survival is uncertain, every imbalance carries extra weight. Jealousy may matter here as well, though it remains one of the least archaeologically visible forces in the whole story. Reproduction in human groups is bound up with preference, alliance, dependency, and status. A partner's shifting attention, the favour shown to a stronger hunter, the protection granted to one child over another, the formation of a coalition that leaves someone exposed. These are the kinds of things that can change the emotional weather of a group without leaving a physical trace. Scholars still debate how much prehistoric social life can be inferred from later foraging societies, and rightly so. No living group is a direct fossil of the Paleolithic. Even so, ethnographic comparison suggests something entirely unsurprising. Small communities are not free of envy. They may be especially vulnerable to it because every relationship matters so much. The camp at night becomes crucial in this sense. Daylight disperses labour and attention. People range outward to gather, track, carry water, search for plant foods, check traps, prepare tools, and tend children. But night compresses life. Bodies return to the same small circle of light and heat. Food is portioned. Stories, gestures, private allegiances, and subtle humiliations unfold in close quarters. The fire is protective, but it is also revealing. There is no darkness thick enough to hide who was favoured, who came back empty-handed, who arrived late, who watched and did not help, who took more than was offered. This environment rewards emotional control, but not everyone will possess it equally. Temperament varies. Some people are quick to anger, quick to dominance, quick to physical assertion. Others are quieter, but more strategic, remembering slights and waiting for moments of advantage. The archaeological record cannot assign personalities to skeletons, but human behavioral variation is too deep and too consistent across cultures to imagine a prehistoric world without difficult individuals. The question is not whether they exist. The question is how a group containing them continues to function. In many cases, social restraint is likely powerful. Ridicule, avoidance, mediation by older members, collective pressure, and the constant need for cooperation probably keep many disputes from escalating. The remarkable fact, after all, is that human groups usually hold together despite constant reasons to fracture. Yet restraint has limits. A person who feels cornered, dishonored, repeatedly deprived, or physically threatened may decide that the usual balance no longer protects him. Someone stronger may begin to use ordinary force shoves, grabs, intimidation not as momentary outbursts but as a pattern. The difference between tension and lethal danger often begins there, not in one spectacular event but in accumulated permission. Children growing up inside such a group absorb these tensions long before they understand them. They watch bodies interrupt one another. They see who steps back and who never does. They hear the change in breathing before conflict. They learn that a hand can steady, feed, and soothe, but also seize, strike, and deny. This is part of how social fear becomes embodied. The threat is not abstract. It is encoded in posture, spacing, eye direction, and the movement toward or away from certain objects. No written tradition records these lessons, but they may be among the oldest human knowledge of all. One lesser-known detail from studies of violence in small-scale societies is that lethal conflict does not always arise from strangers colliding at boundaries. It often emerges from repeated interactions among people who know one another far too well. That pattern likely reaches deep into prehistory. Strangers can be threatening, but intimate rivals are often more dangerous because they understand one another's habits, weaknesses, and triggers. A person who knows when another sleeps heavily, when he walks alone, where she stores a sharpened tool, or how he reacts when embarrassed possesses an advantage no outsider would have. Campfire suspicion is therefore not simply generalized fear. It is targeted, memory-rich, and specific. This is also where exclusion becomes a powerful mechanism. In a small group, there are subtle forms of social death long before literal death. Food is shared less readily. Conversation or attention thins around one person. Alliances shift. A vulnerable individual finds himself sitting farther from the center, trusted less with children, chosen less often for cooperative tasks. Such marginalization can restrain disruptive behavior by making its cost visible. But it can also intensify desperation. The person being edged outward understands, even if only dimly, that continued isolation may become catastrophic. In that condition, violence may appear as the last available way to alter status or settle fear. What survives in the ethnographic and primate records suggests that coalitions matter enormously in such conflicts. Humans are rarely just individuals in tension. They are siblings, mates, allies, parents, protégés. Support can deter violence or escalate it. A grievance carried alone may remain suppressed. The same grievance backed by kin becomes heavier, riskier, more likely to spill into force. This does not require organized warfare or formal clan systems. It requires only the ordinary human tendency to defend those closest to us and mistrust those aligned against us. Once conflict becomes collective, even in a very small way, lethal outcomes become more plausible. There is also the role of humiliation, which may be more ancient than many theories of violence allow. A person struck in front of others, deprived in a visible way, mocked, displaced from a valued position, or treated as weak does not merely lose comfort. He loses standing. In a tiny group where contribution and reputation affect access to food, partners, and protection, standing matters intensely. Scholars still debate how much concepts like honor can be projected backward into prehistory, but some sensitivity to rank and face is almost certainly old. Mammalian social systems already depend on it in simpler forms. In humans, with our greater memory and imagination, humiliation may acquire a longer afterlife. The campfire therefore becomes more than a source of heat. It is the place where social order is performed and judged. A person close to the center is visible as secure. A person lingering at the edge may be secure too, but he may not feel so. A child sleeping between trusted adults is protected differently from one attached to a marginal figure. Every arrangement is practical, but also meaningful. The fire throws light across bodies and tools alike, and with that light comes comparison. No single explanation fully accounts for why one group passes through hardship without lethal conflict while another breaks. Some may be held together by unusually strong kin bonds. Some may be fractured by ecological pressure. Some may tolerate dominant individuals because they are useful. Some may remove troublemakers early. The evidence remains incomplete, and any universal story would be false. But the broad pattern is clear enough to matter. The realization that humans can kill one another does not emerge only from physical ability. It emerges from social strain accumulating in intimate spaces where memory is long and escape is limited. By now, in the unfolding human story, the possibility of killing is no longer unimaginable. Tools have become ambiguous. Bodies have already taught their vulnerability. What remains is the slow change in everyday awareness. People begin to notice danger not only in the storm, the predator or the rival band seen at distance, but in the person across the fire whose silence feels wrong tonight, whose hand stays on the heavy stone a moment too long, whose resentment has stopped being invisible. The camp does not fall quiet all at once. There is no single instant when trust ends, but a new kind of listening enters the group. Breathing is watched. Movements in darkness matter. Near the fire, where humans gather to feel less alone, suspicion takes its place among the oldest companions of the night. The clearest traces of early human violence do not come from stories, because there are no stories yet in any form we can hear. They come from bone. Bone is stubborn. It does not remember feelings, but it does remember force. A blade that slices soft tissue may leave nothing behind after enough centuries, but a heavy strike to the skull, a point driven into a rib, a fracture that heals crooked. An impact that caves in the cranial vault, these can survive for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. That is why the prehistoric record of violence is at once so direct and so maddening. It shows damage with brutal honesty, but it cannot easily tell us why that damage happened, who caused it, or what the witnesses thought as they looked upon it. Still, some skeletons seem almost unwilling to let the matter rest. Across a growing number of archaeological sites, bodies appear with injuries that suggest something more than accident. Something more than a bad fall or the ordinary hardships of a dangerous environment. Depressed skull fractures recur in places where natural explanation alone begins to feel strained. Embedded projectile points in human remains point toward conflict that passed beyond shoving distance. Multiple individuals from the same location sometimes bear similar traumatic injuries, raising the possibility not of isolated incidents, but of repeated patterns. What survives in the record suggests that interpersonal violence is not a late historical invention added by kings and cities. It may be deeply woven into parts of the human past long before written memory begins. One of the most difficult features of this evidence is that it asks to be interpreted case by case. A single broken skull is almost never enough. Even a healed fracture, while suggestive, can still be explained in more than one way. A fall on rock, a kick from a large animal, a hunting accident, a collapsing tree limb, an object dropped during work all remain possible in certain contexts. Scholars are right to be cautious. Prehistoric bones have often been overread by people too eager to find either proof of primeval savagery or proof of primeval innocence. The evidence remains incomplete, and both extremes flatten the complexity of the record. Yet when similar injuries appear repeatedly, and especially when they cluster in anatomically telling places, the argument changes. Pattern becomes more informative than any single specimen. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from injuries that were survived. A skull fractured by a heavy blow but later healed tells a complicated story. Someone was struck hard enough to nearly die, but not hard enough to be removed from the group forever. Or perhaps the attacker intended to injure rather than kill. Or perhaps the injured person was simply fortunate. Whatever the case, that healed wound means the event did not vanish with the moment. The injured person carried it for months or years. Others saw the swelling, the recovery, the changed shape of the bone. They remembered. A healed injury is therefore not merely proof that violence existed. It is proof that violence could become part of ordinary social memory. In some later prehistoric cemeteries and burial grounds, the accumulation of such injuries becomes especially striking. There are individuals with multiple healed cranial wounds, others with forearm fractures that resemble attempts to shield the head, and still others with puncture injuries suggesting attack by sharp implements. The exact frequency varies enormously across time and place. Some communities show little clear evidence of violence. Others show enough to suggest that conflict was a recurring part of life. No single explanation fully accounts for this unevenness. Environment, population density, mobility, social structure, technology, and sheer chance all likely play roles. But the unevenness itself is revealing. Human violence is neither absent nor constant. It emerges under certain conditions, recedes under others, and takes forms that change with culture and circumstance. Then there are the sites that feel more like interruptions than cemeteries. Bodies found in positions that suggest haste, disorder, or a death without normal burial care. Individuals with injuries that were clearly fatal, sometimes accompanied by evidence of multiple victims in a single place. These are among the strongest indications that killing sometimes moved beyond one-on-one conflict into episodes of broader social violence. The better-known examples from later prehistory can tempt us to read organized warfare backward too quickly. But even earlier sites raise unsettling possibilities. A cluster of bodies bearing trauma is hard to absorb as mere accident, especially when projectile points or repeated head wounds are involved. Yet even here, certainty is elusive. Burial practices differ. Preservation is uneven. Some bones are disturbed long after death by animals, roots, erosion, or later human activity. Trauma that looks violent may in some cases be post-mortem. This is why forensic methods matter so much. Archaeologists and osteologists examine fracture edges, healing, coloration, and the microscopic characteristics of breaks to determine whether a wound happened around the time of death, long before it, or long after burial. That work is painstaking, and it often overturns earlier assumptions. The bones do speak, but only if read with discipline. A lesser-known but important detail is that not all violence leaves the same kind of evidence. Soft tissue injuries disappear. Strangulation, beating that avoids bone, or stabbing that misses the skeleton may vanish entirely from the archaeological record. This means the violence we can detect is almost certainly only a subset of the violence that occurred. It is biased toward what bone can preserve. That fact should make any confident claim about low levels of ancient interpersonal violence more tentative than it sometimes appears. absence of evidence is not proof of peace. At the same time, it should also restrain dramatic claims about endless brutality. What we see is partial in both directions. Massacre sites, where they exist, force the issue more bluntly. Multiple bodies with lethal trauma in one context push interpretation toward coordinated or repeated violence. Some of the most famous such sites come much later than the earliest human phases, but they matter because they show where the long arc may lead not just injury, not just personal grievance, but episodes in which entire groups become targets, even before reaching those stronger cases. However, the scattered earlier signs prepare the ground. A body struck, another pierced, another buried with old trauma that never properly healed, another missing burial altogether. The archive is thin, but it is not empty. There is also a question of who bears these wounds. In some contexts, adult males appear disproportionately affected, especially in cranial trauma. In others, women and children are also represented among the injured or dead. That distinction matters because it may hint at the scale and character of violence. Conflict among adult men within or between groups might produce one pattern. Raids or attacks on camps might produce another. Scholars still debate these interpretations, and the demographic profiles are often too small or too incomplete to support broad universal claims. But the variation suggests that prehistoric violence is not one thing. It ranges from personal assault to group aggression, from survivable conflict to fatal episodes that engulf multiple lives. The existence of care alongside violence makes these bones even harder to read emotionally. Some individuals with severe injuries clearly survive because others support them through recovery. A person with a damaged limb, a deformed joint, or a healed skull fracture may have required food sharing, protection, and patience. This is one of the central contradictions of the human record. The same communities capable of inflicting injury are often capable of sustaining the injured. Compassion and violence appear in the same archaeological horizons, sometimes in the same skeleton. Scholars still debate how to interpret that overlap. Does it suggest violence was regretted, controlled, normalized, or simply absorbed into daily life? The record cannot say, but it does warn against simple moral narratives. Bones also tell us something about repetition. A population with many healed injuries is not necessarily experiencing high fatal violence, but it may be living with frequent low-level aggression. Repeated non-fatal trauma can create a climate of fear just as effectively as rare killings. It teaches caution, encodes status, and leaves visible reminders of who has power and who has suffered. In that sense, the skeletal record preserves not only moments of death, but long histories of intimidation, assault and survival. And then there is the unsettling possibility that some evidence of violence has been misclassified for generations, because earlier researchers did not expect to find it. Archaeology is shaped by the questions it asks. For a long time, some scholars leaned heavily toward images of peaceful Paleolithic life, while others favored darker models of endemic aggression. As methods improve, old collections are re-examined, and bones once dismissed as accident or damage are looked at again with sharper tools and different assumptions. The picture continues to shift. That alone is a reminder that the story is not settled. What emerges from all of this is not a simple conclusion, but a difficult pattern. Human bones from deep and later prehistory preserve signs that bodies were sometimes struck, pierced, and broken by other humans. The frequency remains debated. The motives are mostly lost. The contexts vary. Some injuries heal, others do not. Some communities seem relatively untouched, others marked by repeated trauma. No single explanation fully accounts for this range. But the idea that lethal and non-lethal interpersonal violence belongs only to later civilization is no longer easy to defend. The bones say something harder than that. They suggest that humans have been navigating the possibility of harm from one another for a very long time, not everywhere in the same way, not always at the same scale, but long enough for scars to become memory, memory to become expectation, and expectation to shape behavior. A skeleton cannot tell us what the first witnesses felt when they saw a familiar body broken by familiar hands. It cannot tell us whether they responded with horror, revenge, silence, or resignation. But it can tell us that such moments happened often enough to enter the oldest archive we have. Hidden under soil, inside caves, beside ancient watercourses and abandoned camps, the evidence waits in fragments. And when enough fragments are placed beside one another, they begin to form a difficult truth. Humans did not merely learn that death existed. They learned, again and again, that they could be the ones who delivered it. The most important change may not be the act itself, but the understanding that follows it. A body can be broken by force. That much the world has already taught. Bones crack beneath falls, teeth shatter under impact, flesh opens on stone, and animals kill with terrible efficiency. But deliberate human killing introduces something more destabilizing than injury or even death. It reveals intention behind the event. It is one thing to grieve a person taken by cold, infection, or predator. It is another to stand in the aftermath of a death and know that someone chose it. That knowledge alters the emotional structure of a group in ways no fossil can fully preserve, but the logic of it is hard to escape. Once humans grasp that death can be caused by one of their own, trust itself becomes more fragile. This is the psychological threshold hidden beneath the archaeological one. The first buried body with a fractured skull matters. The first skeleton pierced by a point matters. But beneath those traces lies a more elusive turning point, the moment someone recognizes that another human being can decide to end a human life. Not merely in frenzy, not merely by accident, but because the mind can move the hand toward that outcome. This realization does not require formal morality, law, or theology. It only requires memory and inference. The body on the ground is enough. The wound is enough. The silence that follows is enough. For a small prehistoric group, that silence would have been immense. These are communities structured around repeated presence. People know who gathers which foods, who walks first at dawn, who soothes a child, who is quick with tools, who complains, who laughs, who sits slightly apart, who returns late. In such a setting, the removal of one person by deliberate force does not simply leave a practical absence. It opens a psychological void. If this can happen once, then under what conditions can it happen again? Who is capable of it? Was the killer always capable of it? Or has something changed? The mind cannot let such questions rest, even if no words exist yet to frame them cleanly. This is where human imagination, one of the great engines of survival, becomes a source of dread. The same ability that allows people to picture tomorrow's hunt, next season's water source, or the movement of prey across broken ground also allows them to anticipate danger from each other. After a deliberate killing, imagination no longer works only outward against the environment. It turns inward toward the social world. A person begins to picture quarrels ending badly, begins to recall past slights with new significance, begins to notice how easily a stone fits the hand, how vulnerable the neck is, how quickly a sleeping body can be reached. This does not mean every group becomes paranoid. It means the impossible has become imaginable. That shift in imagination may be one of the deepest origins of human caution. Not caution around cliffs or large predators, but caution around anger, grievance, humiliation, and sudden movement. The group begins to read emotion differently once it knows emotion can turn fatal. Raised voices, tense posture, an argument carried too long after dark, a person sitting apart and sharpening a point with too much concentration, these become charged. Before, such signs might still be troubling. Now they are potentially predictive. What survives in the record suggests that many early societies must have developed informal ways of diffusing such danger, even if those methods leave almost no trace in soil or bone. The shock of deliberate death is also likely cumulative. The first witnessed killing is one kind of rupture. The second is another. By then the act no longer belongs to the impossible. It belongs to memory. A group that has seen one member kill another can no longer respond as though violence were an unforeseeable eruption. It begins to sort people differently. The impulsive person is watched more closely. The isolated one becomes either more vulnerable or more suspect. The physically strong individual may become both protector and threat in the same imagination. This is how a single act can alter social gravity. People do not simply remember what happened. They reorganize their instincts around the possibility of recurrence. There is a strange detail here that matters. Deliberate killing may reveal not only danger, but a new kind of power. To end another life is to prove that one can control the final boundary in the most extreme way available to a human being, even if the act is feared, condemned, or avenged. It still demonstrates capacity. That demonstration can shape the behavior of witnesses. Some may become more cautious and peace-seeking. Others may become more willing to threaten, because they have now seen what threat can mean. In this way, the psychological shock of the first killing may radiate in two directions at once. It produces fear of violence and, in some individuals, fascination with the effectiveness of violence. Scholars still debate how early such recognition becomes socially embedded rather than episodic. In a very sparse world of highly mobile bands, a killing might remain an extraordinary rupture, remembered but not normalized. In denser regions or among groups under repeated pressure, the same kind of event might begin to harden into expectation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for why violence becomes a recurrent feature in some settings and not in others. Yet the underlying psychological mechanism is ancient and plausible enough. Once a group has witnessed intentional killing, it can never fully return to a state in which that possibility does not exist. This has consequences for kinship as well. A death inflicted by an outsider is one kind of injury. A death inflicted by a close companion, sibling, mate, or long-known rival is far more corrosive. The closer the relationship, the deeper the breach. Prehistoric groups likely depend so heavily on mutual recognition that betrayal from within would have felt especially destabilizing. The person most dangerous to you may not be the one strongest in the abstract, but the one who knows where you sleep, how you move when you're alone, and whom you trust. Deliberate death therefore teaches a second lesson beyond bodily vulnerability. It teaches the vulnerability of intimacy itself. There may also have been attempts to contain the shock through meaning. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. They do not sit easily with raw catastrophe, even in deep prehistory, before symbolic life becomes richly visible in the archaeological record. People likely search for causes and responses. Perhaps the killer is treated as polluted, dangerous, changed. Perhaps the victim's body is handled with unusual care. Perhaps a place becomes avoided after a killing. Perhaps objects associated with the act are discarded, broken, or buried. These possibilities are difficult to prove, but they are grounded in a broader human tendency to ritualize what frightens us most. Deliberate death is not only practical loss, it is also moral and emotional contamination, even before morality exists in formal language. A lesser-known clue may lie in the treatment of the dead themselves. Some prehistoric burials appear careful, even tender, suggesting that death does not always erase belonging. If a person killed by violence is still buried with attention, still placed within communal memory, then the group may be trying to repair something torn by the act. Burial, in that sense, becomes more than disposal. It becomes a response to shock, a way of saying that although the body has been broken by human hands, it will not be abandoned like animal remains or left wholly to scavengers. Scholars still debate how much symbolic meaning can be drawn from early burials, but some form of emotional reckoning seems likely. Children witnessing or learning of such deaths would carry the effect even further. A child does not need to understand motive to absorb danger. The memory of adults moving in panic, of blood, of unusual silence, of the absence that follows, could shape behavior for years. Fear becomes inherited not only genetically or environmentally, but socially. A generation that has seen deliberate killing will raise the next with different caution. Stay away when tempers rise. Do not approach from behind in darkness. Watch the hands. These lessons need not be spoken as rules to be learned. They can settle into posture and habit, becoming part of the embodied knowledge of the group. There is also the possibility of desensitization. Not every community would respond to violence with enduring horror. Under some conditions, repeated exposure may normalize injury and death, folding them into the expected range of human behavior. This too is part of the story. The shock of deliberate death may be greatest the first time or the first few times. After that, in some environments, it may become a grim fact rather than a paralyzing revelation. That shift would be historically decisive. Once killing becomes imaginable and then familiar, it is easier to organize around it, justify it, and eventually institutionalize it. The path from shock to system begins here, not later. Yet it would be wrong to imagine early humans simply crossing this threshold and becoming cold. The emotional wound of deliberate killing likely remains profound precisely because these groups are so intimate and interdependent. The same species that kills is also the species that grieves, remembers, and cares for the wounded. Deliberate death therefore creates not just fear, but contradiction. How can the same hand that fed, carried, or defended now become the hand that destroys? That contradiction may be one of the earliest moral puzzles ever faced by human minds. The answer is not found in a single principle. It lies instead in the growing awareness that humans contain incompatible capacities: cooperation and cruelty, protection and domination, shared vulnerability and chosen harm. The first deliberate killing forces this realization into the open. Not philosophically, not in a speech or law, but in raw experience. The group sees that human beings are not only companions against the dangers of the world, under certain conditions, they are among the dangers. And once that truth is felt, the whole social landscape changes. A campfire still offers warmth, kin still offers safety, the group still remains the best chance of survival. But confidence is no longer simple. Every bond now contains a shadow cast by memory. Every argument carries a deeper edge. Every silence can mean more than silence. The dead cannot explain what has happened. The killer may not be able to explain it either. But the witnesses do not need explanation to understand the essential fact. A threshold has been crossed. Not only can humans die, humans can decide that other humans should. That is a knowledge far heavier than any stone. Once a human group has learned that one of its own can deliberately kill, the act does not remain a private fact for long. It begins to pull other human tendencies into its orbit. Memory gathers around it. Fear rearranges itself. Grievances stretch across time. Kin remember injuries done to kin. Prestige clings to those who can dominate, defend, or retaliate. What may begin as a single lethal encounter, shocking and perhaps rare, can slowly become part of a broader pattern of meaning. This is where killing starts to move beyond immediate anger or panic and becomes entangled with revenge, status, loyalty, and the earliest forms of power. Revenge is one of the oldest human logics because it requires only a few things the species already possesses in abundance: memory, attachment, and the ability to connect present action to past injury. A child is struck, a sibling is killed, a mate is taken, a humiliating wound is left unanswered. The group does not forget. In a world without courts, written contracts, police, or distant rulers, the wound remains socially alive until something addresses it. Sometimes that response may be avoidance or separation. Sometimes it may be compensation in food, labor, or alliance. But in other cases, especially where trust has already broken down, the demand for balance may settle on violence. Harm asks for harm in return. What makes this especially dangerous in small-scale societies is that revenge rarely remains confined to the original two people. Humans are not socially solitary. Every person belongs to a web of relatives, allies, obligations, and remembered favors. If one man is killed, his brothers, parents, companions, or adult children may feel the injury as partly their own. If one woman is attacked, those tied to her by blood, partnership, or reciprocal care may react as though the blow has landed inside their own circle. The result is escalation. A death ceases to be merely the end of one life and becomes a standing claim on the future. Scholars still debate how far back such dynamics can be projected, but the underlying ingredients are ancient. Even among non-human primates, retaliation, coalition, and alliance behavior appear in recognizable forms in humans with far greater memory and symbolic capacity. Those impulses can become deeper and more enduring. This does not mean every injury triggers a vendetta. Far from it. Many communities almost certainly develop strong pressures against endless retaliation because such cycles are ruinous. But the fact that humans must develop restraint suggests the pressure itself is real. This is also where power begins to change shape. Before lethal violence is fully imaginable, influence in a group may rest largely on competence, age, reliability, or kinship position. A good forager, a skilled maker of tools, an experienced tracker, a calm elder, a capable parent. These forms of authority help hold small communities together. Once killing enters the social field, however, another form of influence emerges: the ability to intimidate. A person known to be dangerous, or believed capable of decisive violence, carries a different weight in the imagination of others. He may be obeyed not because he is wise or generous, but because defying him feels risky. That development does not need formal leadership to matter. It can operate in tiny gestures: who sits nearest the center, who interrupts without challenge, who claims the best share, who is approached carefully when angry. Over time, a reputation for violence can become a social tool in itself. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric communities probably vary enormously in how much such behavior is tolerated. In some, the dangerous individual may be expelled or killed. In others, he may persist because his aggression is useful against outsiders, or because his kin are too numerous to oppose. No single explanation fully accounts for which pattern prevails in which setting. But once violence begins to confer leverage, a new sort of hierarchy becomes possible. Ritual enters this story not necessarily as formal religion at first, but as repetition given meaning. Humans are creatures of patterned behavior. When something frightening happens, especially something socially destabilizing, people often respond by formalizing their reactions. The body is arranged in a particular way. Certain objects are handled differently. A place becomes marked as dangerous or important. A weapon, or rather an ordinary tool that became a weapon, may be kept, hidden, broken, or buried. Blood, death, and memory tend to attract symbolic behavior even before symbol systems become archaeologically obvious. Scholars still debate how early this begins and how confidently it can be inferred, but the impulse is deeply human. What is repeated becomes significant. What is significant becomes charged. In that sense, revenge itself may become ritualized. Not in the cinematic sense of dramatic ceremonies under moonlight, but in quieter, harsher ways. Certain injuries must be answered. Certain kin must not be left unavenged. Certain actions carry expectations that outlast the individual event. A retaliatory strike becomes more than emotion. It becomes obligation. Once violence is bound to obligation, it becomes harder to stop. The person who does not retaliate may be seen not as merciful, but as weak, unreliable, or dishonored. This is one of the oldest traps in human social life. The desire to prevent further bloodshed collides with the fear that failing to answer bloodshed invites more of it. A lesser known but revealing point from anthropology is that small societies are often capable of extraordinary nuance in handling violence. They are not simply trapped between chaos and revenge. Mediation, compensation, arranged marriages, gift exchange, temporary separation, and public shame can all function as alternatives. That matters because it reminds us that humans do not move automatically from the first killing to endless feud. The capacity for social repair is ancient too, but repair is difficult when status is involved. If a violent act visibly lowers one person or one kin group in the eyes of others, practical settlement may no longer feel sufficient. The injury has become reputational. Reputation may be one of the most powerful invisible forces in the rise of organized violence. In a small group, everyone knows what happened. In a network of neighboring groups that meet, avoid, exchange mates, or compete for resources, memory can extend outward. A band known to retaliate fiercely may deter attack. A band known to absorb losses without response may attract predation from others. This does not require formal politics. It requires only repeated encounters and the human ability to generalize from them. Over time, violence becomes not just reaction, but signaling. A killing communicates capacity. A response communicates resolve. At that point, the social uses of killing broaden. It can still arise from anger or fear, but it can also serve as a display. A person who strikes decisively may not only eliminate a rival, he may send a message about rank. A group that retaliates against another may not only avenge the dead, it may demonstrate cohesion. What began as intimate violence starts to shade into political violence in the oldest sense of that word, action aimed at ordering relationships within and between groups. The archaeological record preserves little of the emotional texture of this transition, but it preserves hints of its consequences. Injuries that cluster in certain demographics, repeated trauma that suggests cycles rather than one-off incidents, burials that may reflect special treatment of the violently dead, objects placed with bodies in ways that imply identity, conflict, or display. None of these pieces alone can prove ritualized vengeance or status violence. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet together they suggest that killing does not remain psychologically raw forever. Human communities work on it, interpret it, justify it, and embed it within social expectations. There is also the darker possibility that violence becomes attractive to some because it simplifies uncertainty. In small groups, resentment, ambiguity, and contested status can smolder for long periods. Deliberate force cuts through that ambiguity. It clarifies who dominates and who must submit. This is one reason violence can become tempting even when it is costly. It is crude, but effective. Scholars still debate whether prehistoric aggression is better understood as adaptive strategy, emotional overflow, or social failure, and the answer is likely some shifting combination of all three. But once force proves capable of settling disputes quickly, even temporarily, its social appeal grows. Children raised in such environments learn more than fear. They learn scripts. They see when retaliation is praised, tolerated, or condemned. They watch who is protected and who is expendable. They absorb whether strength brings admiration, whether restraint brings respect, whether avenging kin is expected. In this way, violence begins to outlast the individuals who first enact it. It becomes cultural before it becomes institutional. Not law yet, not armies yet, but inherited expectation. Power, then, is no longer only the power to find food, read weather, or make tools. It includes the power to wound, to threaten, to defend one's own, and to compel memory in others. A person capable of violence acquires a kind of gravity. A group willing to act together acquires more. This is the seed of a long future. The first systems of authority may not all grow from violence, but violence begins early to braid itself around authority wherever fear, loyalty, and reputation meet. This does not mean prehistoric life becomes a permanent theatre of revenge. That image would be too simple and too dramatic. Most days are still occupied by hunger, weather, childcare, injury, movement, and labour. Most interactions are still cooperative because they must be. But beneath that daily necessity, a new current moves. People remember wrongs. They calculate responses. They attach meaning to bloodshed. They start to understand that killing can protect, elevate, punish, avenge, or intimidate. That understanding is profoundly dangerous because it gives violence a future. An impulsive blow ends with the blow. A killing wrapped in obligation does not. It lingers. It recruits the living. It waits for the next opportunity to restore balance or assert dominance, depending on whose memory is doing the counting. Somewhere in those early camps and contested landscapes, the human species begins to discover that violence can do more than remove a body. It can create debt. It can create fear that lasts longer than pain. It can reorder who stands where in the circle of belonging. And once killing starts to perform those functions, it becomes harder to treat as an accident of temperament or momentary loss of control. It becomes part of the social machinery itself, crude and unstable but unmistakably powerful. The hand that kills is no longer only angry, it is beginning, in the oldest and bleakest sense, to rule. By the time the evidence becomes strong enough to unsettle even cautious scholars, violence has already widened beyond the intimate circle of a single quarrel. The injuries are no longer confined to one skull with one suspicious fracture. or one body carrying the memory of a single blow that healed badly. Instead, there are places where multiple people die together, where trauma appears across several skeletons in the same context, where the pattern suggests not a sudden private eruption but something broader, colder, and more collective. These are the moments when the old possibility hardens into something unmistakable. Humans are no longer only discovering that they can kill one another, they are discovering that they can do so in groups. This is one of the most chilling thresholds in the prehistoric record, because group violence changes everything. A one-on-one killing, however shocking, can still be explained through rage, jealousy, fear, or revenge between known individuals. A massacre asks for more. It implies planning, participation, alignment, and at least a temporary willingness to treat several human beings not as singular companions or rivals, but as a category of targets. The emotional and social leap required for that is enormous, yet the evidence, fragmentary though it remains, suggests that the leap was made long before written history began. Some of the most discussed prehistoric sites preserve precisely this kind of difficult testimony. Bodies are found together with signs of violent death, skulls crushed, ribs pierced, projectile points lodged in bone, hands or forearms positioned as though raised in defense. Sometimes the dead include men, women, and children. That detail matters. Conflict between adult males can be explained in one way. The presence of entire groups among the dead suggests something different, an attack not just on an individual opponent, but on a camp, a family cluster, or a neighbouring community. Scholars still debate the exact circumstances at many of these sites, and rightly so. Preservation is uneven. Depositional history can be confusing. The evidence remains incomplete. But there are places where accident simply becomes too weak an explanation. One of the best-known prehistoric massacre contexts from later foraging lifeways has drawn intense attention precisely because it looks so stark. Individuals found unburied or only lightly covered, with cranial trauma, embedded points, and broken bones. Some seemingly left where they fell. The image it creates is grimly immediate. A violent event interrupts ordinary life so abruptly that the dead are not treated with the careful burial seen elsewhere. Whether such sites represent a raid, an ambush, a dispute over territory, a struggle over resources, or something more specific remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. But what survives in the record suggests something larger than a duel. It suggests coordinated killing. Even earlier and more ambiguous sites raise similar possibilities. Clusters of individuals with perimortem trauma, repeated impact injuries across several bodies, or settlements showing signs of violent disruption all point toward the same unsettling conclusion. Prehistoric humans, under some conditions, were capable not only of harming one another individually, but of participating together in lethal aggression. This does not yet mean armies in any formal sense. There are no uniforms, no permanent barracks, no written commands, but the psychological ingredients of collective violence are already present: shared grievance, perceived threat, coordinated action, and the classification of another group as killable. That last point may be the most important. It is hard enough for a human being to kill someone known intimately. To participate in the killing of several people at once often requires a mental shift in how victims are perceived. They may still be recognized as human, of course, but not as members of the same moral circle. They become rivals, enemies, trespassers, threats, or burdens. The labels themselves are lost to us, but the distinction is visible in outcome. Once an entire cluster of people can be attacked, The boundary between us and them has become more than practical. It has become lethal. This process likely develops slowly and unevenly. In sparsely populated worlds, neighbouring groups may rarely meet, and when they do, the encounter may end in avoidance rather than conflict. In more crowded or constrained landscapes, the same meeting may carry higher stakes. A water source can only support so many bodies. A migration route can be blocked. A shellfish bed, a good hunting ground, a stand of useful plants, or a defensible shelter zone may become worth defending or seizing. What survives in the archaeological and ethnographic records suggests that mobility can reduce some forms of conflict by allowing groups to move away, but mobility has limits. When options narrow, violence becomes harder to escape. A lesser known but revealing aspect of massacre sites is that they often preserve evidence of vulnerability as much as aggression. Some victims appear to have been struck from behind. Some seem to have died while trying to protect themselves rather than fight back. Some include the very young or elderly, individuals unlikely to be primary combatants in any direct sense. This reminds us that collective violence is rarely symmetrical. It may involve surprise, pursuit, or opportunism. A raid at dawn, an attack on a weakened camp, a return blow against a group already diminished by hunger or disease. These are all possibilities scholars consider in interpreting such sites. The image of prehistoric violence as honourable face-to-face combat is no more reliable than the image of universal peace. Massacres also reveal something crucial about participation. For several people to die violently in one event, more than one person may need to accept or at least tolerate what is happening, even if only a handful of attackers are involved. Their actions depend on some degree of mutual reinforcement. One person strikes because another is there. One pursues because others are pursuing. Fear is shared, but so is permission. This social permission may be among the most dangerous human inventions. Once a group can convince itself that violence is necessary, justified, or advantageous, the individual hesitation that might restrain a lone killer begins to thin. The archaeological record offers only glimpses of how communities respond afterward. Some massacre victims are buried carefully, suggesting survivors return, mourn, and try to restore dignity to the dead. Others are left exposed or incompletely buried, perhaps because no one remains with the power or safety to perform proper rites. That difference matters emotionally. A careful burial suggests not only grief, but social continuity after catastrophe. An abandoned body suggests a deeper rupture. In either case, the memory would have been intense. Children who survive such attacks, if any did, would carry a vastly different understanding of human danger than those who knew only internal quarrels or isolated killings. There is also the question of whether massacres represent rare breakdowns or recurring patterns. Scholars still debate this vigorously. Some argue that spectacular violent sites are memorable precisely because they are exceptional, and that most prehistoric life remains far more cooperative than such evidence implies. Others counter that only a tiny fraction of ancient deaths preserve under conditions favourable to discovery. So the visible massacre record may understate rather than exaggerate the true frequency of group violence. Both cautions have merit. The evidence remains incomplete, and any confident global estimate would be misleading. Yet even if massacres are rare, their significance is immense. A rare catastrophe can still reshape social behaviour for generations. Once a community knows that a neighbouring group is capable of wiping out a camp, abducting people, or killing the vulnerable, caution intensifies, watchfulness increases, territory matters more, night movement changes, children are kept closer, approaching strangers are read with greater suspicion, Weapons, or rather ordinary tools with lethal potential, are carried more consistently. Defensive cooperation strengthens. In this way, even infrequent massacres can enlarge the role of violence in everyday life far beyond the immediate event. Fear scales upward. Another surprising detail is how prehistoric massacre evidence complicates older theories that warfare begins only with settled farming societies. Agriculture certainly changes the scale, frequency, and incentives of conflict in major ways, and later sections of the story will turn to that transformation. But the existence of lethal group violence among foragers or highly mobile populations suggests that the roots run deeper. Humans do not need walls, kings, or grain stores to discover collective killing. Those later institutions magnify the practice, but the core capacity appears older. At the same time, it would be a mistake to flatten all forms of prehistoric group violence into war in the later sense. Many events may be episodic, local, and loosely organized. A revenge raid is not the same as a campaign. An ambush over access to a place is not the same as a professional military operation. The vocabulary of history can easily impose too much order on earlier violence. Still, the distinction should not soothe us too much, whether or not we call it war. The bodies preserve the essential fact multiple humans acting together can decide that multiple other humans should die. That realization may be one of the darkest expansions of the original threshold. First comes the understanding that one person can kill another. Then comes the understanding that a group can do it more effectively, more safely, and with wider consequences. Violence becomes not just personal ability, but coordinated strategy. The emotional burden of killing may even become easier to bear when distributed across several participants. Responsibility diffuses, fear of retaliation lessens. Success appears more likely. The victims, meanwhile, become harder to perceive as individuals once they are encountered as part of an opposing cluster. This is how massacres before history announce the arrival of a new human power. Not a noble one, not an advanced one in any moral sense, but a potent one. Humans can synchronize harm. They can move beyond anger into operation. They can create scenes of death so abrupt and total that the archaeological record still shudders with them tens of thousands of years later. The old campfire circle is still there somewhere in the background of this story, the place where suspicion first entered the night, where a single blow first changed trust. But now the circle has widened. Whole camps can become targets. Whole groups can vanish into a layer of disturbed earth and broken bone. And from that point on, the human past is no longer haunted only by individual killers. It is haunted by the knowledge that people can gather, decide together, and make death communal. The deeper the record is examined, the less satisfying simple answers become. There is a strong temptation to tell this story as either a fall or an inheritance. In one version, violence is ancient, lodged deep in the species, waiting only for opportunity. In the other, humans are mostly cooperative by nature, and lethal conflict rises later when changing conditions crowding. Property, hierarchy, scarcity distort an originally more peaceful social world. Both views have evidence behind them. Both also fail, on their own, to account for the full range of what the bones, campsites, tools, and burial grounds seem to show. This is why the question remains unsettled even now. Scholars still debate not only how often prehistoric humans killed one another, but what kind of explanation best fits the patchwork we find across time and space. Some point to cranial trauma, massacre sites, defensive injuries, and embedded projectiles as signs that lethal aggression is older and more deeply rooted than once imagined. Others emphasize how uneven these traces are, how many communities show limited signs of conflict, and how cooperative care for the injured appears again and again in the same broad human story. No single explanation fully accounts for the coexistence of tenderness and brutality, restraint and bloodshed. Part of the difficulty lies in what archaeology can and cannot recover. Bones preserve some injuries and not others. Burials preserve some deaths and not others. Landscapes are not neutral archives. A body left on open ground may vanish almost completely. A killing in which soft tissue is damaged but bone remains untouched may disappear from the record. A burial disturbed by water, scavengers, roots, or later humans may lose the very clues scholars most need. This means the distribution of evidence is always shaped by preservation, chance, and discovery. The visible past is not the full past. It is the portion that survived long enough to be found and studied. That uncertainty has encouraged two opposite mistakes. One is to treat every suspicious injury as proof of a violent species. The other is to assume that because evidence is incomplete, early violence must have been minimal. Both positions ask too much of imperfect remains. What survives in the record suggests something harder and more believable. Human violence is ancient enough to appear before cities and states, but variable enough that it cannot be described as constant or inevitable in the same form everywhere. The roots are old. The expression changes. Evolutionary explanations often enter the discussion here, and with reason. Humans descend from ancestors who compete, form coalitions, defend offspring, and respond aggressively under threat. No human population exists outside biology. The capacity for aggression is real, and it likely offered advantages in some situations, defending children, deterring rivals, securing access to mates, protecting territory, or resisting predation from other humans. Yet capacity is not the same as destiny. The same evolutionary story also selects for cooperation, empathy, food sharing, communication, long childhood dependency, and care for the injured. Human survival depends too much on others for a purely violent model to make sense. This tension has produced one of the most enduring arguments in anthropology. And archaeology: are humans violent because violence helped shape the species? Or do humans become more violent when certain social and material conditions intensify conflict? The most honest answer may be that both are true, but at different levels. The capacity is old. The scale, frequency, and organization of violence depend far more on environment and social structure than any single inherited impulse can explain. Population density is one factor often proposed. In a thinly populated world, groups can sometimes avoid each other. Tension exists, but space offers a solution. When people become more numerous, routes overlap, water sources are contested, and retreat becomes harder. This does not automatically produce killing, but it narrows the range of peaceful exits. A dispute that might once have dissolved through movement may now persist, because both sides need the same patch of ground, the same river crossing, the same hunting corridor. Scholars still debate how much density alone matters, but it is difficult to ignore as a multiplier. Resource stress is another major explanation, though not in the simplistic sense that hunger always causes violence. Some communities under extreme stress cooperate more, not less. Scarcity can strengthen solidarity just as easily as it can inflame conflict. What seems to matter more is the combination of stress with inequality, blocked movement, repeated encounters, or previous grievance. A poor season is survivable. A poor season in a crowded landscape beside a hostile neighbour is something else. The evidence remains incomplete, but across human history, violence often intensifies where necessity and memory collide. Technology also complicates the picture. Once projectile weapons, stronger hafted points, clubs, and eventually more specialized killing tools become widespread, the costs and opportunities of violence shift. People can attack more effectively, from farther away, and sometimes with greater safety to themselves. But technology does not create motive. It amplifies whatever motives already exist. A spear does not invent resentment, fear, or revenge. It gives them reach. In that sense, technological change matters most when combined with social change. Then there is culture, which may be the most decisive variable of all and also the hardest to recover in deep time. Some groups appear to have developed norms that strongly restrain internal violence, emphasize sharing, ridicule boastfulness, or isolate dangerous individuals before conflict escalates. Others seem to have tolerated more status competition, revenge expectations, or aggressive male prestige. Later ethnographic comparisons suggest that human societies can vary enormously in how they interpret and manage anger, injury, and retaliation. There is no reason to believe prehistory lacked such variation simply because writing did not yet exist. A less known but important point in these debates is that peaceful behavior can leave less evidence than violent behavior. One massacre site can dominate scholarly imagination because it is dramatic and visible, while centuries of ordinary cooperation vanish almost without trace. A healed injury tells us both that violence occurred and that care occurred, yet the violent moment usually attracts more attention. This creates an interpretive imbalance. Humans may have spent far more time feeding one another, carrying one another, negotiating, avoiding, and reconciling than killing. But reconciliation rarely fossilizes. Violence often does. At the same time, it is equally dangerous to romanticize the gaps. For much of the 20th century, some theories leaned heavily toward images of early humans as fundamentally peaceful, with serious organized violence emerging only after farming, property, and hierarchy. That picture has been steadily challenged by new finds and new analyses. The older idea that war begins only once land is owned and food is stored cannot easily explain all earlier evidence of lethal conflict. Yet the strongest challenge to that view still does not prove that violence was everywhere all the time. It proves something subtler: humans did not need civilization to kill, but civilization would later give killing new scale and structure. This is why the debate remains so alive. It is not merely about the past, it is about what kind of animal humans are. If violence is deeply rooted, some fear that peace is always fragile and artificial. If violence is mostly conditional, others hope that changing conditions can reduce it. The prehistoric record does not fully satisfy either comfort. It suggests that humans are equipped for both conflict and restraint, and that circumstance determines which capacity is strengthened, justified, and remembered. There may never have been one single moment when all humans everywhere realized they could kill each other. The phrase captures a threshold, but the threshold is crossed unevenly. One group may experience a lethal feud while another, at the same time in another valley or continent, lives for generations with little serious violence. One region may see repeated raids during climatic stress, while another remains relatively stable through norms of sharing and mobility. The truth is plural. Human beings arrive at this realization again and again in different ways, under different pressures, with different consequences. What the evidence can settle is narrower, but still profound. It can tell us that lethal human violence is not merely a product of literate states or modern institutions. It can tell us that some prehistoric communities endure repeated trauma, and that others either do not or do not preserve it. It can tell us that violence and care coexist in the same species and often in the same communities. It can tell us that explanations based only on instinct are too crude, and explanations based only on late social complexity are too narrow. And perhaps that is the most important conclusion available at this stage. The human capacity to kill another human is ancient, but not mechanically determining. It exists as potential in bodies shaped for cooperation as much as for conflict. It becomes real under stress, memory, rivalry, fear, status competition, revenge, opportunity, and sometimes sheer contingency. It becomes more common or more visible when the world narrows around people. It becomes more organized when social systems give it purpose. The old question, were early humans violent by nature or made violent by circumstance, may be asking for a simplicity that the record cannot provide. Humans are a species in which nature and circumstance continually work on each other. The same hands that nurse the wounded can strike. The same minds that imagine cooperation can imagine ambush. The same group that buries its dead with care can create the dead in the first place. The evidence does not let us rest in innocence, but it does not condemn us to one timeless script either. It shows a species with dangerous possibilities and remarkable restraint, each awakened under different conditions. That is less tidy than either extreme and much more unsettling. Because if no single explanation fully accounts for why humans began killing one another, then the capacity does not belong safely to the past. It belongs to a pattern still living inside the species old, adaptable, and always waiting for circumstance to decide what it becomes next. When humans begin to stay put, even for longer stretches rather than permanently at first, the meaning of violence starts to change. Mobility had once provided one of the oldest escape valves in human life. A difficult season, an exhausted patch of land, a hostile neighbouring group, a quarrel that grew too sharp under many conditions. Movement offered relief, not always easy relief, and not without cost, but still a way out. Once people begin tying themselves more closely to fields, stored food, built structures, animal pens, irrigation routes, and the repeated use of the same ground, the old option of simply leaving becomes harder. Conflict no longer moves through a landscape of relative fluidity. It settles into place. This is one of the great transformations in the human relationship with killing. Before farming, violence can already be intimate, terrible, and at times collective. But with cultivation comes a new density of consequence. Land is no longer just somewhere one passes through in search of opportunity. It becomes invested labour. A cleared field holds weeks or months of work. Stored grain holds future survival through winter or drought. A house contains tools, memory, lineage, and claims. Domestic animals can be stolen, butchered, driven off, or defended. What had once been mostly portable in human life knowledge, tools, kin, bodily skill now becomes increasingly fixed in place, and what is fixed can be seized. Agriculture does not invent human violence. The record has already made that impossible to believe, but it changes the stakes so dramatically that older forms of conflict begin to harden into new patterns. A dispute over access to a water source among mobile foragers is serious. A dispute over a field someone has planted, weeded, defended, and expects to harvest months later is serious in a different way. The investment is longer, the loss more measurable, the resentment more durable. Violence now threatens not only the immediate body, but the future stored in landscape. The first farmers do not step into an easy life. For all the later power of agriculture, Early farming often brings harder labour, narrower diets, new disease burdens, and greater dependence on local conditions. Crop failure can be catastrophic. Rain arriving too late or too little matters more when one's survival depends on seeds in one place, rather than many foods gathered across a wider ecology. Sedentism brings children closer together in age because women carrying fewer moves can raise more infants. But more children also mean more mouths to feed and greater vulnerability when harvests falter. Population grows, houses cluster, waste accumulates, animals live closer to humans. The world becomes more productive in some ways and more pressurized in others. Under those conditions, the realization that humans can kill one another becomes heavier and more politically charged. A single death no longer removes only a capable body from a small band. It can alter inheritance, labor capacity, household survival, and access to property. A killed farmer means an untended plot. A killed head of household means uncertainty around who controls stores, animals, tools, and marriage ties. Violence begins to cut through systems that are more layered than those of earlier mobile groups. That added complexity does not civilize conflict. It gives conflict more to work with. Archaeology preserves this transition with painful clarity in some places. Fortified settlements begin to appear in parts of the Neolithic and later prehistoric world. Ditches, walls, palisades, defensive positioning on slopes or enclosed ground, these do not prove constant war, but they strongly suggest that communities are thinking in collective terms about threat. One does not build a ditch around a settlement because a single quarrelsome individual is difficult to manage. One builds it because attack from outside has become imaginable enough, or frequent enough, to justify labour on a communal scale. The same is true of burned settlements, clustered trauma patterns, and bodies found in positions suggesting violent disruption. Scholars still debate how widespread such insecurity is in different regions and times, but the broad direction is unmistakable. Farming communities often organize themselves with defense in mind. There is a lesser-known irony here. Agriculture creates surplus, but surplus can attract predation. Grain can be stolen more easily than moving herds of wild game or the portable skill of a hunter. A storehouse becomes a target. A settlement visible from a distance becomes a known location. Permanence invites both investment and envy. What survives in the record suggests that some of the earliest villages may have learned this quickly. Their wealth is not modern wealth. It is sacks of grain. Drying food, pottery, domestic animals, and access to fertile soil. But to neighbours under stress, that is enough. This may be the point where killing begins to shift more decisively from episodic reaction toward organised possibility. Not yet states, not yet professional armies in the full sense, but more stable patterns of raiding, retaliation, and territorial defence. A village can plan watch systems. It can stockpile projectiles. It can train, or at least rely repeatedly on certain individuals for defence. It can remember which neighbouring communities are dangerous and pass that memory to the next generation in more durable ways. Violence acquires continuity because the settlement itself persists long enough to remember. Property changes human emotion too. In a mobile world, possessions matter, but most are what the body can carry. In a farming world, attachment extends outward into structures, fields, boundaries, and stored provisions. To trespass is no longer only to intrude. It is to threaten labour condensed in material form. To burn a house is to destroy more than shelter. It is to erase accumulated work and perhaps ancestral continuity. Killing, therefore, becomes entangled with possession in a new way. A human being may now die not only over a slight, a feud, or an immediate survival need, but over control of things that will still matter after the season turns. The social consequences are equally profound. Sedentary communities tend to generate stronger distinctions between insiders and outsiders because belonging is tied to place. The question is no longer merely who travels with us, but who belongs on this land, who has rights to this irrigation channel, who may marry into this household, who may store grain here, who may pasture animals nearby. Boundaries become sharper, even when not formally mapped, and sharp boundaries make exclusion easier to justify. The stranger is not just unfamiliar. He may be a threat to the reproductive and economic future of the settlement. Scholars still debate whether farming initially increases violence everywhere, or whether its effects vary widely depending on ecology, social organization, and local traditions. The evidence remains incomplete, and regional differences are crucial. In some places, agriculture may coexist for long periods with relatively low levels of organized conflict. In others, signs of trauma, fortification, and violent disruption appear more strongly. No single explanation fully accounts for this variation. Yet what farming clearly does is expand the number of things that violence can be about. It enlarges motive. Inequality also begins to matter more. Once goods can be stored and transmitted, not everyone must possess the same amount. Some households gain more land, more animals, stronger alliances, better locations, or more secure claims. Differences in status, once perhaps more fluid in smaller foraging bands, can harden. That hardening creates resentment and opportunity. The wealthy can be targeted. The poor can be exploited. A powerful family may use force to hold advantage. Rivals may use force to challenge it. Violence begins to interact not only with survival, but with social ranking embedded in material life. This is why the transition to agriculture is not only an economic revolution, it is also a moral and strategic one. The old knowledge that humans can kill each other now enters a world where killing can reshape access to land, labour, wealth, and lineage. A raid that once might have been about revenge can now also be about resources. A murder within the settlement can now alter succession or property. A feud can spill into the destruction of infrastructure on which many depend. The circle of consequence widens again. The body itself does not change much in this transformation. A skull still fractures. A rib still yields under impact. A point still pierces flesh. But the context surrounding the body grows denser. More people live near one another. More children survive into crowded settlements. More stores can be plundered. More labour can be coerced. More memory can be attached to place. The same ancient human capacity to harm now operates inside larger, more settled webs of dependence. That makes each act of violence both more local and more expansive. More local because it is tied to specific houses, paths, fields, and walls. More expansive because those things bind many lives together. A striking detail from some early farming regions is the coexistence of domestic routine and defensive anxiety. Grinding stones, hearths, storage pits, figurines, ovens, and burials beneath floors all speak of continuity and intimacy. Yet alongside them appear walls, burned layers, trauma, and abrupt abandonment. The peaceful and the violent are not separate phases neatly arranged one after the other. They inhabit the same settlements. Families bake, harvest, repair roofs, bury their dead, and fear attack all in the same social world. This is perhaps the defining condition of early sedentary life stability so valuable that it becomes worth killing for. The realization that humans can kill each other was once a shattering threshold in a small circle of faces around a fire. Under farming, that same realization becomes embedded in the architecture of everyday life. It lives in the wall at the settlement edge, in the guarded path to water, in the way grain is hidden or counted, in the suspicion attached to strangers at harvest time, in the memory of burned houses and fields trampled by other feet. Violence is no longer only a possibility carried by bodies and tools. It is a structural fact shaping how communities build, store, marry, inherit, and defend. And once human beings begin arranging entire settlements around the expectation of threat from other humans, the old threshold has passed into something much larger. Killing is no longer merely something a person can do. It is something a community must plan against, justify, and sometimes organize for itself. That is when the knowledge becomes truly consequential, not because the act is new, but because the world built around it has changed. Fields, walls, granaries, houses, graves, everything now stands inside the shadow of the same ancient realization, and everything has become harder to walk away from. Once killing becomes a known human possibility inside settled life, communities face a problem more difficult than the act itself. A death can be avenged, mourned, hidden, justified, or denied. But the possibility of future death from the same source cannot simply be wished away. A village that has seen one household attack another, or one kin group retaliate against its rivals, or strangers arrive in the dark with torches and points, cannot return to the earlier comfort of improvisation. It must begin to build responses. This is where one of the oldest social revolutions takes shape, not in kingship yet, not in written law, but in the collective effort to contain revenge before revenge consumes everyone. The first restraints are likely informal and deeply personal. Older people intervene, respected figures mediate, kin step between enemies before blood is drawn. Dangerous individuals are watched, shamed, sidelined, or forced outward. Ordinary tools are put beyond reach during tense moments. Meetings happen in the presence of many witnesses rather than in isolation. None of this requires formal institutions. It requires only memory, social pressure, and the growing realization that a community which cannot limit internal violence may not survive long enough to worry about enemies beyond its boundaries. What survives in the record suggests that many prehistoric groups must have developed such habits, even when those habits leave little direct archaeological trace. This is one reason the emergence of social order should not be imagined as a purely noble moral awakening. It is also practical self-defense. In a small settlement or clustered farming village, cycles of retaliation can destroy labor, fracture alliances, orphan children, and invite attack from outside. A feud is expensive in calories as well as emotion. If two households stop cooperating at harvest time, the grain suffers. If adult men or women are disabled or killed, childcare changes. Defense weakens, and old people become more vulnerable. If revenge divides a village too deeply, neighbors may seize the moment to raid. Restraint is not only ethical, it is efficient. Taboos likely arise in this space. Humans have always used prohibition to protect what they fear losing most. Some acts become too dangerous to leave morally ambiguous. Perhaps one must not strike within certain ritual settings. Perhaps bloodshed near stored food, burial places, or water access becomes especially condemned. Perhaps killing a close relative, a host, or someone under the protection of certain kin carries a heavier social reaction than other forms of violence. Scholars still debate how early such distinctions can be inferred and how visible they are archaeologically. The evidence remains incomplete, yet no single explanation fully accounts for the stability of early communities without assuming some strong norms around when violence is forbidden, when it is tolerated, and who has the authority to judge the difference. Punishment, in its earliest forms, need not look like later criminal justice. It may be expulsion, forced compensation, arranged marriage, seizure of goods, ritual humiliation, or a retaliatory injury controlled by collective agreement rather than private vengeance. This last possibility is important. In many small-scale societies known from much later periods, the community does not always eliminate vengeance, it channels it. A death might be answered by a negotiated settlement. A serious wound might require gifts, livestock, labour, or marriage exchanges that restore a workable balance. The goal is not abstract justice in the modern sense. It is the prevention of endless spirals. That distinction matters because early moral systems are probably less about universal principles than about preserving relational order. The question is not simply was killing wrong, but what kind of killing has now made future life together unstable? A death in self-defense may be understood differently from an ambush. A revenge killing may be treated differently from the murder of a sleeping relative. The categories may not be articulated in writing, but they almost certainly exist in practice. Communities that fail to distinguish cases would be trapped in the same undifferentiated fear every time blood is spilled. Human groups are too socially intelligent for that. They classify, they weigh, they remember precedents even without formal courts. This is where reputation becomes institutional in a primitive but powerful sense. Certain families or individuals may become known as mediators, peacemakers, or enforcers of settlement. Others may become marked as volatile, polluted by repeated violence, or too dangerous to trust with shared responsibilities. Over generations, these reputations can begin to resemble offices without yet becoming offices. A person is listened to in disputes because his lineage settled disputes before. Another is feared because her kin retaliate quickly and collectively. The road toward formal authority is often paved by repeated responses to danger. A lesser-known irony runs through this process. The same community mechanisms that restrain violence can also legitimize it. Once a group agrees that some acts must be punished, someone must decide what counts as punishment and who gets to carry it out. A controlled beating, an execution, an expulsion into deadly conditions, a sanctioned revenge against the right target. These can all emerge under the banner of restoring order. In that sense, the attempt to contain killing may also normalize certain forms of killing. Scholars still debate how far back such sanctioned violence can be traced, but the logic is ancient. The boundary between justice and force is not a late problem. It begins almost as soon as communities try to govern bloodshed. The spatial organization of settlements may also reflect this new need for control. Open central areas where disputes can be seen by many, houses arranged by kin clusters for mutual oversight, storage places secured collectively rather than privately, boundaries between households marked more clearly, meeting places near the center rather than the edge. These features have many possible explanations, and archaeologists must be cautious not to overread them. But in some cases, settlement patterning may do more than manage labour and access. It may reduce opportunities for hidden violence, or make collective intervention easier when conflict arises. Children in such communities grow up not merely with fear of violence, but with scripts for managing it. They learn who may intervene when tempers rise. They learn which injuries demand collective response and which require silence or endurance. They learn that some people can be challenged and others cannot. They learn the cost of crossing certain lines. In this way, moral order becomes embodied before it becomes written. A child watches adults break up a quarrel, distribute compensation, shame an aggressor, or gather witnesses after an accusation. Long before law codes, there is pedagogy. The development of burial customs may also intersect with this emerging order. A violent death that receives formal treatment from the community can become a statement that the dead still belong within the social whole, and that the community retains authority over meaning even after bloodshed. Conversely, withholding burial or treating a killer's body differently may communicate exclusion beyond death. These are difficult inferences and must remain cautious. But what survives in the record suggests that treatment of the dead is often one of the clearest windows into how the living manage moral boundaries. There is another pressure pushing communities toward order. Internal violence weakens external defense. Once agriculture, stored food, and fixed settlements create greater exposure to raids, villages cannot afford constant internal fragmentation. This may be one reason feuds sometimes begin to give way, however unevenly, to broader communal norms. The settlement needs cooperation to survive, and that need may override the immediate emotional satisfaction of personal revenge. Not always. Of course, history never moves so neatly, but the practical incentive is strong. A village divided against itself is easier prey. No single explanation fully accounts for how these early systems arise in every place. In some regions, strong kin authority may dominate. In others, ritual specialists may play a greater role. In still others, councils of elders, household heads, or temporary coalitions may arbitrate conflict. The diversity was almost certainly immense. Yet the underlying problem is shared once humans know they can kill each other, and once killing threatens a more settled social world. Some mechanism must emerge to limit when, why, and by whom violence may be used. This is the beginning of something larger than peace but smaller than law. It is social order in its roughest form, built from taboo, memory, pressure, and negotiated restraint. It does not eliminate bloodshed. It classifies it. It tries to keep rage from spilling outward into permanent fracture. It creates the first moral fences around the ancient human capacity to destroy. And perhaps that is one of the great quiet achievements of our species, often overshadowed by the violence that made it necessary. Humans did not only discover that they could kill, they also discovered that if everyone acted on that knowledge without limit, the group would collapse. Out of that recognition came some of the first rules worth obeying, not because they were beautiful, but because survival demanded them. The old threshold then leads not only to fear and retaliation, it leads to judgment, to the first dim sense that some acts cannot be left to private appetite, that bloodshed changes the whole community, and therefore belongs, in some form, to the whole community to answer. The first moral systems may not have been born from philosophy. They may have been born from the need to keep one killing from becoming 10. And once a society begins to decide whose violence is forbidden, whose is tolerated, and whose is sanctioned, it has stepped into a new world. The hand that once struck in impulse is now being weighed by collective memory. The dead are no longer only mourned, they are counted. Once communities begin drawing moral lines around violence, another line grows beside them, quieter at first but no less powerful. It is the line between those who belong within the circle of restraint and those who do not. This may be one of the most consequential developments in the entire human story, because it changes not only how people justify killing, but whom they can imagine killing without shattering the social order that holds them together. Inside the circle, bloodshed is regulated, mourned, negotiated, punished, or avenged. Outside the circle, those same limits may weaken dramatically. The invention of enemies begins there. In the smallest and oldest human groups, belonging is probably intimate before it is abstract. One belongs because one is known, because one was fed here, carried here, buried beside these people, named in gestures, linked by kinship, shared labour, familiar smell, remembered injury, repeated care. The moral community is face-sized. It is built from repetition. But as populations grow, as settlements hold longer, as exchange networks widen, and as neighbouring groups meet more often under tense conditions, the old scale of belonging begins to stretch. Humans must decide not only who is with us in a camp tonight, but who counts as part of the larger social world worth protecting tomorrow. In making those decisions, they also decide who stands outside it. This is not a sudden philosophical act. It emerges from ordinary distinction. These are our children. Those are theirs. These are our graves. Those are not. This is our water source, our path, our planted ground, our marriage alliance, our ritual place. People beyond those boundaries may still trade, marry, negotiate, or cooperate. Outsider does not immediately mean enemy. In many cases, the opposite is true. Alliances between groups are essential. But the possibility now exists for a stranger to be classified more quickly as threat than as person under shared obligation. The distance is social before it becomes lethal. Archaeology cannot preserve the full texture of this process, but it preserves its outlines. Settlements become more bounded. Burial customs vary between groups, material styles, pottery, ornaments, tool forms, body modification, house design mark identity in ways visible to insiders and outsiders alike. These markers are not created for violence alone. They communicate belonging, lineage, taste, exchange, memory. Yet once group identity becomes visible, it can also be weaponized. Difference makes sorting easier. Sorting makes exclusion easier. Exclusion makes violence easier to justify. Scholars still debate how strongly prehistoric communities identified themselves against others, and how often material differences corresponded to hostile boundaries. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for why some neighbouring groups coexist peacefully, while others clash repeatedly. But the deeper pattern is unmistakable. The more clearly people define who they are, the more clearly they may define who they are not. That act of definition has creative power, but it also has a cost. It creates the mental architecture in which enemies can exist. The word itself is modern in this context, but the structure behind it is ancient. An enemy is not merely someone dangerous. Plenty of dangerous things do not become enemies. A storm is dangerous. A leopard is dangerous. Hunger is dangerous. An enemy is a human threat interpreted through social categories. Someone who is dangerous, and also outside the moral obligations reserved for one's own. That distinction matters because it changes the emotional burden of violence. To kill someone within the circle threatens the integrity of the circle. To kill someone outside it may be framed as defense, necessity, duty, or even virtue. This helps explain why group violence can become more systematic than personal violence. The greatest obstacle to killing is often not physical, but psychological. Humans know too much about other human bodies. They recognize pain too easily. They imagine the internal life of others with uncomfortable accuracy. But social distance can dull that recognition. Not completely, and not always, but enough. Once another group is remembered mainly through raids, competition, insults, boundary disputes, or stories of past injuries, its members become easier to perceive as a collective danger rather than as individuals who resemble one's own kin. Memory does some of the hard work. So does fear. Children raised in such a world inherit categories before they inherit direct experience. They learn who must be watched at the edge of the settlement, whose approach changes adult posture, which accents, ornaments, roots, or body markings signal caution. By the time they are old enough to act, they may already know that some people deserve protection automatically and others do not. This is one of the oldest and darkest deficiencies in human culture. The emotional labour of deciding whom not to harm is done early, repeatedly, and socially. Violence later draws upon classifications built long before the moment of contact. A lesser-known but revealing detail from anthropology is that hostility between groups often coexists with exchange between them. Neighbours may raid each other and still marry, trade, negotiate access, or observe ritual obligations under special conditions. This complicates any simple story of enemies as wholly alien. Often the most dangerous outsiders are not distant strangers, but familiar rivals close enough to share landscapes and sometimes kin, distant enough to be denied full trust. That may be true deep into prehistory as well. The earliest enemies are probably not incomprehensible foreigners from beyond the horizon. They are likely the people one meets again and again at the same crossing, the same seasonal camp, the same contested valley. This familiarity makes enmity more durable. A faraway danger can be ignored between encounters. A nearby rival shapes routine. Water is fetched differently because of them. Fields are watched because of them. Paths are taken or avoided because of them. Marriages are arranged with them or against them. Stories are told about them. Wounds are remembered in relation to them. In this way, enemy identity becomes part of everyday life rather than an occasional emergency. The stranger at the boundary is no longer just an unknown human. He arrives already carrying the weight of collective memory. That memory does not need to be accurate in a modern historical sense to be effective. It only needs to be shared. One raid becomes a story told as warning. One murder becomes proof of what they are like. One burned field, one insult during exchange, one broken agreement over access to pasture or water can harden into a moral portrait passed down through generations. Scholars still debate how much of prehistoric hostility can be reconstructed through such mechanisms, but later human history offers the pattern repeatedly enough to make it plausible. Groups remember selectively. They preserve injuries longer than kindness. They generalize from fear. Once that happens, killing outsiders may become easier to defend than violence within the group. This is one reason internal social order and external aggression often grow together rather than separately. A community may tightly regulate murder among its own members while praising courage against outsiders. It may punish feud at home while rewarding violence beyond the boundary. The same moral system that limits killing can therefore sharpen the distinction between protected lives and expendable ones. This is not hypocrisy in the eyes of the people living it, it is structure. The rule has not vanished. The rule has narrowed its circle. This narrowing has profound consequences for leadership and solidarity. Nothing binds a group like shared threat, especially a human one. Leaders can emerge by promising protection. Households can unify by recalling the same enemy. Rituals can deepen around defense, mourning, and revenge. A child becomes adult by joining the protective obligations of the group. In this way, the enemy does not merely threaten the social order, the enemy helps produce it. That is one of the bleakest feedback loops in human development. Communities sometimes become more coherent not despite danger from others, but because of it. The archaeological hints of this process are indirect but suggestive. Fortifications, clustered settlements, repeated rebuilding after burning, standardized projectile production, and burial treatment of those killed in conflict all imply communities thinking not only about violence in general, but about violence from specific human others. Distinctive regional styles may also harden in periods of stress. Though the reasons are never singular, identity becomes visible because identity matters. And when identity matters under threat, difference can become destiny. No single explanation fully accounts for why some boundaries become deadly and others remain porous. Ecology matters, population pressure matters, historical accident matters. One theft or murder can trigger generations of distrust if it occurs under the wrong conditions. Another can be settled and forgotten under different ones. Humans are not mechanically tribal in one timeless way. They are situationally tribal, capable of widening or narrowing the circle depending on memory, leadership, fear, and need. That flexibility is part of what makes the story so unstable. The line between neighbour and enemy is never as fixed as people often imagine. But once fixed in practice, it can be terribly real. And so the invention of enemies is not simply the birth of hatred. It is the narrowing of moral imagination under pressure. It is the decision, repeated often enough to become habit, that some humans count differently. Once that decision is available, violence acquires a new logic. It can be preventive rather than reactive. It can be celebrated rather than regretted. It can be taught as duty rather than excused as rage. The old campfire knowledge that one human can kill another has now expanded into something colder and more scalable. Not only can people kill, they can divide the world into those whose deaths threaten the group and those whose deaths protect it. Inside the circle, restraint grows. Outside it, the hand becomes freer. That is one of the oldest dangerous ideas our species ever produced, and once it takes hold, the path toward organized violence becomes much easier to walk, because the hardest part has already been done. The victims have been moved, in thought first, beyond the reach of full belonging. Once the human mind has learned to divide, remember, justify, and retaliate, violence no longer depends on sudden anger alone. It can be organized. That is the crucial change. A killing born from panic dies with the moment unless memory feeds it. A killing woven into plans, roles, expectations, and shared purpose becomes something else entirely. It becomes a system, not immediately a state, not yet the full machinery of kings, tribute, and standing armies, but the beginnings of a human arrangement in which destruction is no longer accidental to social life. It is prepared for, distributed across people, and built into the ways communities think about danger, honor, territory, and survival. This transformation is easy to misunderstand because later warfare casts such a long shadow backward. Once bronze blades, chariots, walls, chronicles, and imperial campaigns appear, it is tempting to imagine that organized violence begins there, but the roots run deeper. Long before banners and written commands, humans have already learned several lessons that make systematized violence possible. They know that coordinated killing is more effective than isolated violence. They know that group identity can widen internal loyalty while narrowing sympathy for outsiders. They know that certain individuals are especially useful in conflicts stronger, braver, more practiced with projectiles or close combat, more willing to act under pressure, and they know that preparation matters. Preparation is one of the oldest signs that violence has moved beyond impulse. A settlement that keeps stockpiles of stones at likely defensive points is preparing. A group that places homes with watchfulness in mind is preparing. A community that trains younger members in projectile use not only for hunting but in an atmosphere of threat is preparing. None of this requires written doctrine. It requires anticipation. It requires the ability to imagine future conflict as likely enough to organize around in advance. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that by later prehistory, many communities in many regions have reached exactly that point. Defensive architecture, specialized projectile concentrations, repeated trauma patterns, and settlement clustering all hint at lives shaped not just by episodic danger, but by the expectation of human attack. Once that expectation takes hold, roles begin to differentiate. In the smallest groups, almost everyone must do everything to some degree: gather, repair, carry, care, defend. But as communities grow and conflict becomes more regular, some individuals become more identified with violence than others. These need not yet be professional warriors in the later sense. They may still farm, herd, hunt, or craft. Yet their place within the group is altered by recurrent participation in raids, defense, retaliation, or protection. Reputation gathers around them. Skill with weapons, endurance under fear, willingness to pursue enemies, and success in protecting one's own begin to create status of a new kind. Violence is no longer merely something anyone might do. It becomes something certain people are expected to do well. That expectation changes leadership. Earlier authority may rest largely on age, mediation skill, ritual knowledge, generosity, or experience. Those forms do not disappear, but they now compete with another basis of influence: military usefulness. The person who can organize defense, lead a retaliatory party, or intimidate rivals acquires weight in decision-making. Scholars still debate how early and how widely such leadership crystallizes, but the tendency is difficult to avoid once organized violence becomes recurrent. Communities threatened from outside often elevate those most capable of confronting that threat. Protection and coercion begin to overlap. The protector can become the ruler, or at least the prototype of one. A lesser-known but important detail in this transition is that organized violence often feeds on logistics more than fury. A raid requires timing, route knowledge, food, coordination, and often secrecy. A defended settlement requires maintenance, stored projectiles, lines of sight, labor investment, and shared discipline. These are mundane things, but they matter enormously because they drag violence into ordinary routine. The work of killing is no longer limited to the instant of impact. It begins much earlier in preparation, provisioning, planning, and the collective agreement to act together. That is what makes violence systemic. It recruits daily life. Children raised in such communities inherit a world already arranged around these expectations. They learn where danger comes from and who responds to it. They see certain tools treated with special seriousness. They absorb stories not only of injury but of successful defense, bold retaliation, and honorable courage. They learn that group survival may depend on swift organized action. In this way, violence ceases to be merely remembered experience and becomes pedagogy. A new generation is taught not only that humans can kill each other, but that we must be ready to do what is necessary when they appear. This process also reshapes time. Earlier violence may be immediate and personal, tied to a slight, feud, or sudden confrontation. Organized violence stretches across seasons. A community may prepare after harvest because raids are more likely in lean months. It may avoid certain routes at certain times of year. It may postpone exchange gatherings or send larger parties to water or pasture. The rhythm of life becomes calibrated against human threat. When that happens, violence has become more than an event. It has become an environment. The archaeological record captures pieces of this environmental shift in striking ways. Hilltop settlements, palisaded enclosures, bastions, watch-friendly layouts, burn destruction layers followed by rebuilding, and concentrations of weapon-like artifacts all suggest communities adapting structurally to conflict. Yet scholars remain careful, because no single feature proves war on its own. A wall may also control animals, a ditch may drain water, a hilltop may be chosen for symbolic reasons as well as defense. The evidence remains incomplete, and each case must be judged in context. But when several such features converge alongside trauma and patterns of regional instability, the interpretation grows stronger. Humans are not just reacting to violence, they are building worlds that assume it. One of the grimmest consequences of systematized violence is emotional distancing. In a small-scale quarrel, the victim is usually known intimately. In organized conflict, the target may still be familiar in a broad sense, but not personally. Distance makes coordination easier. So does routine. The first killing shocks because it violates trust and reveals possibility. Repeated organized violence dulls that shock by embedding killing inside expected roles. A person no longer asks only, "Can I do this?" He may ask instead, "When do we move, or who guards the rear?" This is not because human empathy vanishes. It is because institutions, even very early ones, redistribute responsibility and make violence feel less like a singular personal crossing and more like participation in collective necessity. That collective necessity is often exaggerated by leaders or memory keepers, but it does not need to be invented from nothing. Real raids, real losses, real burned homes, and real dead children are enough to generate powerful commitment to organized response. No single explanation fully accounts for why one community systematizes violence more deeply than another. Geography matters, neighboring threats matter, inequality matters, trade routes, prestige goods, drought, migration, and leadership all matter. Yet once organized violence proves effective, it tends to reproduce itself. Success encourages repetition. Victory legitimizes leaders, spoils reward participants, defensive measures become permanent. The machinery remains even when the immediate cause fades. This is the threshold at which violence begins to produce institutions rather than merely disrupt them. Councils may form around defense, labor may be directed toward walls or stockpiles. Young men, and in some societies others as well, may be socialized into distinct martial obligations. Rituals may emerge to bless departures, commemorate the dead, or bind participants to one another. Identities harden under repeated conflict. The enemy becomes structurally necessary to the cohesion of the group, and the group becomes structurally dependent on those who can confront the enemy. From here, the path toward later state warfare is not guaranteed, but it is clearly visible. Once violence is expected, prepared for, distributed, rewarded, and remembered collectively, the leap to larger organized systems becomes one of scale rather than essence. The first armies will later add hierarchy, bureaucracy, specialized weapon production, and political administration. But the moral and social groundwork has already been laid in much older settings. Humans have learned how to organize fear, channel loyalty, and make killing serve durable social purposes. There is something especially bleak in this realization because it turns an ancient discovery into a durable structure. The first human who understood that another human could be killed stood at the edge of a terrible possibility. Much later, communities stand inside that possibility and begin arranging their lives around it. The knowledge has matured. It is no longer a shocking secret carried by witnesses. It is built into walls, training, stories, expectations, and leadership. And yet even here the contradiction remains. The same coordination that organizes violence also organizes defense, rescue, burial, mutual protection, and the care of survivors. Human collective power is never purely one thing. The group that raids can also rebuild. The leader who commands retaliation can also distribute food in famine. The wall keeps enemies out, but it also keeps children safe at night. That ambiguity never disappears. It is part of what makes human history so difficult to judge in simple moral terms. Our greatest strengths are often entwined with our worst capacities. Still, by this stage the old threshold has become something unmistakable. Violence is no longer simply a possibility of the body or a crisis of emotion. It is a recurring social technology. It has procedures, expectations, specialists, memories, and material supports. It can be activated collectively and justified publicly. It can outlast the people who first set it in motion. What began with a hand, a stone, and a stunned silence after one body did not rise has now become a system through which whole communities prepare to break other communities when conditions demand it. The realization has hardened. Killing is no longer merely what humans can do. It is something they can organize. And once a species can organize killing, history enters a far darker scale. By the time violence becomes something humans can organize, remember, justify, and inherit, the original realization has traveled a very long way from its first dim emergence in the prehistoric dark. It began as a bodily fact, a shattering discovery that one human hand could end another human life. Then it became a social fact, a source of fear inside the group, then a political fact, then a structural one. But the deepest legacy is not only in walls, graves, raid patterns, or rising leaders. It is in the way this knowledge settles into the species itself, into memory, custom, expectation, and restraint. Once humans understand that they can kill each other, they are forced into a second and more difficult task, learning how to live with that knowledge without letting it consume everything else. That may be the oldest moral burden humans ever carried. Other animals kill members of their own kind under certain conditions. But humans do something more dangerous with the fact. They remember it. They explain it. They argue about it. They pass it down. They construct systems to prevent it, excuse it, glorify it, avenge it, ritualize it, and in some cases industrialize it. The first realization, therefore, does not remain in prehistory. It becomes one of the permanent inheritances of human civilization, as enduring as fire, language, or kinship. It travels forward into every settlement, every law, every border, every army, every prayer for peace, every grave cut into earth after a conflict that someone, somewhere, believed was necessary. And yet the legacy is not simply one of escalation. This is important. If the story ended only with humans becoming better and more organized at killing, it would be bleak, but also too simple. The same realization that makes violence possible in a distinctly human way also makes moral reflection possible in a distinctly human way. Once people know what they can do to one another, they begin to create the first serious restraints against doing it. Taboos emerge, feuds are limited. Elders intervene, settlements develop norms, Outsiders may still be treated harshly, but insiders become increasingly protected by rules that would have made little sense before the danger was fully understood. The long history of law, kin obligation, sanctuary, diplomacy, and peacemaking does not stand apart from the history of killing. It grows directly out of it. This is one of the central contradictions of the human story. Violence and civilization are not opposite poles, one primitive and the other refined. Civilization is, in part, what humans build because they know what unchecked violence does. Walls are built not only to separate, but to protect. Law is written not only to command, but to limit bloodshed, ritual burial, mourning customs, compensation systems, taboos around murder, guest protection, rules of retaliation, and eventually treaties all grow from the same ancient recognition that human beings are dangerous to one another in ways no environment alone can explain. What survives in the record suggests that every increase in the human capacity to kill is eventually answered, however imperfectly, by new efforts to contain that capacity. Still, containment is never complete. Scholars still debate whether violence declines in some phases of history and rises in others, whether states suppress interpersonal killing while magnifying warfare, whether inequality or scarcity matters more, whether ideologies of belonging protect life or sort lives into categories of value. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. The evidence remains incomplete even for recent centuries, let alone deep prehistory. But across that long arc, one truth remains constant. Humans never again inhabit a world in which the possibility of deliberate killing by other humans can be forgotten. It becomes part of the background of social existence. That background shapes ordinary behavior in ways so familiar now that they often go unnoticed. Trust itself is structured around it. We decide who may approach our children, who may enter our homes, who may carry weapons, who may judge guilt, who may authorize force, who may cross a border, who must be watched, who counts as protected. Entire legal and political systems rest on managing violence or claiming legitimate control over it. The modern world may appear unimaginably distant from a prehistoric campfire, yet on this matter, the connection is unbroken. The same basic problem remains: how do humans share space with beings exactly like themselves, knowing what those beings are capable of under fear, greed, humiliation, pressure, ideology, or rage? There is a surprising humility in that continuity. For all the grandeur of monuments and empires, the old problem never becomes obsolete. Metal replaces stone, walls rise higher, states claim monopolies over force, religions condemn or sanctify different kinds of killing. Philosophers define justice, but underneath those developments lies the same ancient dilemma first revealed when one human body fell to another's deliberate action. The tools change, the logic becomes more elaborate. The emotional machinery remains recognizably old, and this may be why the prehistoric origins of killing matter so much, not because they allow a simple claim that humans are doomed by nature, nor because they let us flatter ourselves as beings who rose heroically above a savage past. They matter because they expose how early the contradiction appears. Humans are cooperative enough to nurse the injured for years, to share food in scarcity, to raise children collectively, to grieve the dead with care. Humans are also capable of striking, piercing, burning, raiding, and organizing destruction against those they fear or exclude. These are not two separate species. They are one. The oldest knowledge still with us, then, is not merely that humans can kill each other. It is that every social world humans build must decide what to do with that fact, ignore it, and violence spreads through the cracks. Glorify it, and violence becomes a ladder to status and rule. Over-centralize it, and institutions meant to protect can become engines of coercion. Narrow moral concern too far, and outsiders become easy to destroy. But try to restrain it, negotiate it. Remember its cost. And something else becomes possible. Fragile, reversible, never guaranteed, but real, a human order in which the capacity for harm is acknowledged without being allowed to define everything. That is the oldest struggle carried forward from the first blow, not the struggle to eliminate violence entirely, which no society has achieved, but the struggle to keep violence from becoming the dominant language of human relations. Every truce, every burial after a battle, every law against murder, every custom of reconciliation, every parent teaching a child not to strike, every community insisting that some deaths must never be justified, these belong to the same long inheritance as the earliest wounds in bone. They are humanity's answer to its own terrible self-discovery. So the legacy of that first realization is everywhere, even where it is least visible. It lives in memory, fear, law, ritual, architecture, leadership, and ordinary caution. It lives in the burden of history and in the quiet routines that try to make history bearable. It lives in the uneasy truth that the species capable of extraordinary tenderness is also the species that first looked at its own reflection in another person and saw, perhaps with horror, what it might do. The first humans who crossed that threshold left no written warning behind them, but the warning survives anyway, carried forward in scars, customs, and the long human effort to remain a community despite knowing exactly how easily a community can be broken. The memory of that first realization never sits neatly in the past. It lingers in the shape of settlements long abandoned, in skulls mended after old blows, in graves dug with care after lives ended without mercy, in walls raised not against weather but against other human feet. And if the rhythm of this story has felt dark, it is because the knowledge itself is dark. It is one of the oldest shadows in human life, but it is not the only one. Across all that time, alongside every wound and every act of deliberate harm, something else remains just as ancient. People continue to gather the dead. They continue to tend the injured. They continue to teach children how to live near others without constant fear. They continue to build rules, however fragile, around what must not be done. The same species that learns how to kill also spends the rest of its history trying, in one way or another, to keep that power from swallowing everything. Perhaps that is the final image worth holding. Not a battlefield, and not a romantic vision of peace that never existed, but a fire in the dark. Around it sits a group of early humans, tired, watchful, carrying memories that no previous generation may have carried in quite the same way. They know the land is dangerous. They know animals can kill. They know storms can erase tracks by morning. And now, perhaps, they know something worse, that danger can sit inside the circle too. Yet the circle remains. They do not scatter forever. They do not abandon one another completely. They stay close because they must, because survival still depends on shared warmth, shared food, shared attention, shared memory. The knowledge changes them, but it does not end them. It becomes part of what humans are forced to build around, like rivers, winters, droughts, and death itself. That may be the quiet truth beneath everything that follows in history. Civilization is not built by innocent creatures who later become violent, nor by monsters who accidentally learn cooperation. It is built by beings who know both capacities from very early on, and who spend ages trying to keep one from overrunning the other. So when we look back toward that first moment, whether it happened once, or many times, in many different valleys and generations, we're not simply looking at the birth of human violence. We're looking at the beginning of one of humanity's longest struggles to live together after discovering what together can become. And somewhere beyond the reach of names, in a vanished landscape under a cold evening sky, the fire burns low, faces turn toward the dark, and the human story continues with that knowledge now inside it forever.